Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Tonight, we're exploring a case that demonstrates the incredible power of modern forensic science and the unwavering dedication of those who refuse to let justice remain buried. This is the story of Jennifer Walsh, a 19-year-old college student whose brutal murder in Portland, Oregon in 1994 remained unsolved for 3 decades, until a breakthrough in DNA technology finally brought her killer to justice in 2024. What makes this case particularly fascinating is not just the crime itself, but the remarkable journey of how advances in genetic genealogy and the persistence of a single detective transformed what seemed like a hopeless cold case into a landmark conviction. It's a story that spans 3 decades, involves cutting-edge science, and ultimately brings closure to a family that never stopped believing answers would come. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you through the winding path from a horrific crime in the mid-1990s to a courtroom in 2024 where justice was finally served. Jennifer Walsh was the kind of young woman who lit up every room she entered. At 19, she was a sophomore at Portland State University, majoring in elementary education with dreams of becoming a teacher. She lived in a small apartment near campus with her roommate, Lisa Chen, and worked part-time at Powell's Books to help pay for her education. Jennifer came from a close-knit family in Salem, Oregon. Her parents, Michael and Susan Walsh, had raised her and her younger brother, Danny, with strong values and endless support for their dreams. Every Sunday, Jennifer would drive the 45 minutes home to Salem for family dinner, a tradition she rarely missed. The weekend of October 15, 1994, started normally. Jennifer had finished her midterm exams and was looking forward to a relaxing Saturday. She had plans to study at the Multnomah County Library downtown, then meet friends for dinner. It was a routine she followed most weekends. The library was quiet, and she found she could concentrate better there than in her apartment. Jennifer left her apartment around 10 a.m. that Saturday morning, carrying her backpack filled with textbooks and notebooks. She was wearing jeans, a green Portland State sweatshirt, and her favorite pair of worn sneakers. Lisa Chen later told investigators that Jennifer seemed excited about the weekend and had mentioned wanting to start Christmas shopping after her study session. The Multnomah County Library Central Branch was a popular destination for college students. Jennifer had a favorite spot on the 3rd floor, near the windows overlooking the park. The librarians knew her by sight, and several witnesses later confirmed seeing her there throughout the afternoon, working diligently at her usual table. Jennifer was scheduled to meet her friends at 6 p.m. at a restaurant called The Ram, a popular college hangout in downtown Portland. When she didn't show up by 6:30 p.m., her friends began calling her apartment. Lisa Chen hadn't heard from Jennifer since that morning, which was unusual. Jennifer was reliable about keeping in touch, especially when plans were involved. By 8 p.m., Jennifer's friends were genuinely worried. They decided to check the library, thinking she might have lost track of time studying. But when they arrived, the library was closed, and Jennifer was nowhere to be found. Her friends drove around downtown Portland, checking coffee shops and other places Jennifer might have gone, but found no trace of her. Lisa Chen called the Walsh family in Salem around 9 p.m. Michael Walsh immediately drove to Portland, arriving at Jennifer's apartment just after 10 p.m. By midnight, with no word from Jennifer and no sign of her car, a red 1989 Honda Civic, the family made the decision to call the Portland Police Bureau. The initial missing person report was filed at 12:45 a.m. on October 16, 1994. Officer David Martinez responded to the call and began the preliminary investigation. Jennifer's disappearance was concerning because it was so out of character, but in 1994, missing person cases involving college-aged adults were often initially treated as possible voluntary disappearances. However, that changed dramatically at 6:15 a.m. on October 16, when a jogger in Forest Park, Portland's largest urban forest, discovered Jennifer's red Honda Civic parked at a remote pullout along Leif Erikson Drive. The car was locked, with no signs of damage or struggle, but Jennifer was nowhere to be found. Forest Park encompasses over 5,000 acres of dense woodland just minutes from downtown Portland. The area where Jennifer's car was found was known to be secluded, rarely visited except by serious hikers and mountain bikers. It was not a place Jennifer would have gone voluntarily. She preferred well-lit, public spaces, and was not an outdoor enthusiast. Detective Raymond Thompson, a 15-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau, was assigned to lead the investigation. Detective Thompson immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. A missing college student whose car was found in a remote location was almost certainly the victim of foul play. The search for Jennifer began immediately. Portland police, along with volunteers from the university and the local community, combed through Forest Park. Search and rescue teams with dogs spent days methodically searching the dense forest, looking for any sign of Jennifer or clues about what had happened to her. On October 18, 1994, 3 days after Jennifer was last seen alive, a search team made the discovery that everyone had feared but expected. Jennifer's body was found approximately half a mile from where her car had been discovered, in a ravine that was hidden from the main trail. The scene was devastating. Jennifer had been sexually assaulted and killed. The medical examiner determined that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, likely from a rock or heavy object found at the scene. The brutality of the crime was shocking to investigators and the community alike. Detective Thompson launched a comprehensive investigation into Jennifer's murder. The crime scene was processed meticulously, with investigators collecting every piece of potential evidence. This included biological samples, fingerprints, fibers, and any other material that might eventually lead to the killer. The investigation began with Jennifer's last known movements. Security cameras at the Multnomah County Library showed Jennifer leaving the building at approximately 4:30 p.m. on October 15. She appeared to be alone and walking normally, carrying her backpack and purse. This was the last confirmed sighting of Jennifer alive. Detective Thompson and his team interviewed dozens of people, Jennifer's friends, family, classmates, co-workers at Powell's Books, and library staff. They were looking for anyone who might have shown unusual interest in Jennifer, anyone who had seemed to be watching or following her, or anyone who might have had a motive to harm her. The investigation revealed that Jennifer had no enemies, no ex-boyfriends with grudges, and no known conflicts with anyone. She was universally described as kind, generous, and friendly. She dated occasionally but had no serious romantic relationships at the time of her death. Her life was focused on her studies and her part-time job. Investigators also explored the possibility that Jennifer's murder was connected to other crimes in the area. Portland had seen several attacks on young women in the early 1990s, and detectives wanted to determine if Jennifer's killer was responsible for other crimes. However, the modus operandi and location of Jennifer's murder were different enough that investigators concluded it was likely an isolated incident. The physical evidence from the crime scene was extensive. In addition to biological evidence that would later prove crucial, investigators found tire tracks near Jennifer's car, footprint impressions in the soft earth around the crime scene, and fibers that appeared to come from the perpetrator's clothing. However, this was 1994, and DNA analysis was still in its early stages. While investigators knew they had biological evidence from the crime scene, the technology to analyze it fully and compare it to potential suspects was limited. The DNA evidence was carefully preserved, but it would be years before technology advanced enough to make it truly useful. The investigation also focused on trying to understand how Jennifer ended up in Forest Park. There was no evidence that she had driven there voluntarily. Her friends and family insisted she would never have gone to such a remote location on her own, especially not in the evening. This suggested that Jennifer had been forced to drive there, possibly at gunpoint, or that someone else had driven her car there after abducting her from downtown Portland. Investigators canvassed the area around the library and along the route to Forest Park, looking for witnesses who might have seen Jennifer or her car on the evening of October 15. Several people reported seeing a red Honda Civic in the area, but none could provide specific details about the driver or any other occupants. The case generated significant media attention in Portland. Jennifer's murder was covered extensively by local newspapers and television stations. The Walsh family appeared on local news programs, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The university community was shaken by the brutal murder of one of their own, and many students began taking extra precautions for their safety. Despite the extensive investigation and media coverage, no significant leads emerged in the first year after Jennifer's murder. Detective Thompson followed up on dozens of tips, investigated several potential suspects, and worked tirelessly to find Jennifer's killer. However, without a clear suspect or definitive physical evidence that could be processed with 1990s technology, the case gradually went cold. By late 1995, Detective Thompson had exhausted most of the immediate leads. The case remained open, and he continued to work on it when new information came in, but it was no longer his primary focus. The Walsh family was devastated, not just by Jennifer's death, but by the lack of answers and justice. The case files were thick with interviews, evidence reports, and investigative notes, but they pointed to no clear conclusion. Detective Thompson retired in 2001, passing Jennifer's case to other investigators, but he always considered it one of his greatest professional failures, not because he hadn't worked hard enough, but because the technology and resources needed to solve it simply hadn't existed yet. For the next 25 years, Jennifer Walsh's case remained officially open but practically dormant. The evidence was carefully preserved in the Portland Police Bureau's evidence storage facility, and new detectives would occasionally review the case files, but no major breakthroughs occurred. The Walsh family never gave up hope, but they learned to live with the uncertainty and pain of not knowing who killed their daughter and sister. Michael and Susan Walsh became advocates for other families of murder victims, working with local organizations to provide support and resources. They held memorial services for Jennifer every year on the anniversary of her death, keeping her memory alive in the community. Danny Walsh, Jennifer's younger brother, was particularly affected by her death. He was only 16 when Jennifer was killed, and her murder shaped his entire adult life. He became a criminal justice major in college and eventually joined the Portland Police Bureau as a patrol officer, driven by a desire to help other families avoid what his family had experienced. Meanwhile, advances in forensic science were slowly making their way into law enforcement. DNA analysis became more sophisticated and more accessible throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Cold case units were established in police departments across the country, specifically focused on using new technology to solve old crimes. In 2010, the Portland Police Bureau established its own cold case unit, with Detective Sarah Martinez assigned as one of the primary investigators. Detective Martinez had a background in forensic science and was particularly interested in cases where DNA evidence might provide new leads. Jennifer Walsh's case was among the first cases Detective Martinez reviewed when she joined the cold case unit. She was struck by the thoroughness of Detective Thompson's original investigation and by the amount of physical evidence that had been preserved from the crime scene. Detective Martinez arranged for the biological evidence from Jennifer's case to be retested using more advanced DNA analysis techniques that had become available since the 1990s. The results were promising. Investigators now had a complete DNA profile of Jennifer's killer. However, when they searched the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, they found no matches. Jennifer's killer was not in the system. This was both encouraging and frustrating. On one hand, investigators now had definitive DNA evidence that could identify Jennifer's killer if they could find him. On the other hand, without a match in the database, they were no closer to actually identifying the perpetrator. Detective Martinez continued to work on Jennifer's case sporadically over the next several years, always hoping that new evidence or technology might provide a breakthrough. She maintained regular contact with the Walsh family, updating them on any developments and reassuring them that the case had not been forgotten. In 2015, Detective Martinez arranged for additional evidence from the crime scene to be tested, hoping that advances in DNA analysis might reveal more information. The testing confirmed the original DNA profile and provided some additional genetic markers, but still no matches were found in any law enforcement databases. The case remained in this state of limbo until 2020, when a new technology emerged that would finally provide the breakthrough investigators had been hoping for: forensic genetic genealogy. Forensic genetic genealogy represents a revolutionary approach to solving cold cases. Instead of relying solely on law enforcement databases like CODIS, this technique uses publicly available genetic databases and traditional genealogical research to identify suspects through their family relationships. The process works by taking DNA evidence from a crime scene and comparing it to profiles in public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, where people upload their genetic information to research their family history. When partial matches are found, genealogists work backward to construct family trees and identify potential suspects who could be related to the DNA profile. This technique gained national attention in 2018 when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, after decades of unsuccessful traditional investigation. The success of that case led to increased adoption of genetic genealogy by law enforcement agencies across the country. In early 2020, Detective Martinez learned about genetic genealogy and began exploring whether it could be applied to Jennifer Walsh's case. The DNA profile from Jennifer's crime scene was well preserved and complete, making it an ideal candidate for genetic genealogy analysis. However, genetic genealogy analysis requires specialized expertise that most law enforcement agencies don't have in-house. Detective Martinez worked with the Portland Police Bureau's administration to contract with a private laboratory that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy. In June 2020, Jennifer's DNA evidence was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that provides DNA analysis and genetic genealogy services to law enforcement. The process would take several months and cost several $1,000s, but it represented the best hope for finally solving Jennifer's case. The genetic genealogy process began with the creation of a genetic profile that could be searched against public databases. The analysts at Parabon found several potential matches, people whose DNA indicated they shared common ancestors with Jennifer's killer. None of these matches were close enough to be immediate family members, but they provided a starting point for genealogical research. The next step involved painstaking genealogical work. Parabon's team of expert genealogists began constructing family trees for each of the genetic matches, looking for connections and common ancestors. This process can take weeks or months, as researchers work through historical records, census data, birth and death certificates, and other genealogical sources. By October 2020, Parabon had identified a promising lead. Their analysis suggested that Jennifer's killer was likely related to a family from the Pacific Northwest with roots dating back to the early 1900s. The genealogists had constructed a detailed family tree that included dozens of potential suspects, men who were the right age and living in the right area at the time of Jennifer's murder. Detective Martinez began the process of investigating these potential suspects. This involved checking criminal records, verifying alibis, and determining which of the potential suspects had opportunity and means to commit the crime. It was tedious work, but it was the first real progress on Jennifer's case in over 25 years. One name that emerged from the genealogical analysis was particularly intriguing: Robert Allen Kowalski, a 58-year-old man who had been living in Portland in 1994 and had a history of minor criminal offenses. Kowalski had been working as a maintenance supervisor at a downtown office building in 1994, which would have put him in the area where Jennifer was last seen alive. Detective Martinez began a careful investigation of Robert Kowalski in late 2020. What she discovered was both encouraging and disturbing. Kowalski had indeed been living in Portland in 1994, working a job that would have given him access to downtown areas where Jennifer was last seen. More troubling, he had a history of inappropriate behavior toward young women, though he had never been convicted of a serious crime. Kowalski had been married in 1994 but divorced in 1998. His ex-wife, Patricia Kowalski, told Detective Martinez that Robert had become increasingly controlling and aggressive during their marriage. She mentioned that he had stayed out late several nights in October 1994, claiming to be working overtime, but she had suspected he was lying. The investigation also revealed that Kowalski had been questioned briefly during the original investigation into Jennifer's murder. He had been interviewed because he worked near the library where Jennifer was last seen, but he had provided an alibi and was quickly eliminated as a suspect. Detective Thompson's notes showed that Kowalski claimed to have been at work until 6 p.m. on October 15, 1994, then gone home to have dinner with his wife. However, when Detective Martinez re-examined this alibi 26 years later, she found inconsistencies. Patricia Kowalski told her that she remembered the weekend Jennifer was killed because it had been in the news extensively. She said Robert had not come home for dinner that Saturday night, and she had been angry with him about it. Detective Martinez also discovered that Kowalski had left Portland abruptly in 2005, moving to Phoenix, Arizona. He had told people he was leaving for better job opportunities, but his departure came shortly after Portland police had begun retesting DNA evidence in cold cases. While this could have been a coincidence, it raised suspicions. By 2021, Kowalski was living in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was 84 years old, in declining health, but still mentally competent. Detective Martinez worked with Arizona law enforcement to begin surveillance of Kowalski and to collect DNA evidence that could be compared to the evidence from Jennifer's crime scene. The process of collecting DNA evidence from a suspect without their knowledge requires careful planning and legal oversight. Detective Martinez worked with prosecutors to ensure that any evidence collected would be admissible in court. The team decided to use a technique called trash pulls, collecting discarded items that Kowalski had thrown away, which could contain his DNA. Over several weeks in early 2021, investigators collected items from Kowalski's trash, including used tissues, disposable razors, and coffee cups. These items were sent to the lab for DNA analysis and comparison to the evidence from Jennifer's crime scene. On March 15, 2021, Detective Martinez received the call she had been waiting nearly a year for. The DNA analysis was complete, and it was a match. Robert Allen Kowalski was definitively identified as Jennifer Walsh's killer, based on DNA evidence with a statistical certainty of greater than 1 in 100 billion. Detective Martinez immediately began working with the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office in Arizona and the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office in Oregon to coordinate Kowalski's arrest. Because the murder had occurred in Oregon, Kowalski would need to be extradited to face charges there. On March 22, 2021, Robert Kowalski was arrested at his home in Scottsdale on charges of first-degree murder in connection with Jennifer Walsh's death. The 84-year-old man was taken into custody without incident, appearing confused and frail as he was led away in handcuffs. News of the arrest was a shock to the Phoenix area community where Kowalski had been living. Neighbors described him as a quiet, unremarkable man who kept to himself. Many expressed disbelief that someone they knew could be capable of such a brutal crime. For the Walsh family, the arrest was the answer to nearly 27 years of questions and pain. Michael and Susan Walsh, now in their 70s, held a press conference with Detective Martinez to express their gratitude to law enforcement and their relief that Jennifer's killer had finally been identified. "We never gave up hope that this day would come," Susan Walsh said through tears. "Jennifer can finally rest in peace, and we can finally have some closure." Danny Walsh, who had become a police officer partly because of his sister's unsolved murder, was present at Kowalski's arrest. He later said it was one of the most emotional moments of his career and his life. After his arrest, Kowalski was held in Arizona while extradition proceedings were completed. His attorney initially indicated that Kowalski would fight extradition, but within a few weeks, Kowalski waived his right to an extradition hearing and agreed to be transported to Oregon. Perhaps most surprisingly, once Kowalski arrived in Portland and was formally charged with Jennifer's murder, he requested to speak with Detective Martinez. In a recorded interview on April 10, 2021, with his attorney present, Robert Kowalski confessed to killing Jennifer Walsh. Kowalski's confession was both a relief and deeply disturbing. He admitted that he had seen Jennifer at the library and had become obsessed with her. He had followed her when she left the building, confronted her in the parking area, and forced her at knife point to drive to Forest Park. Kowalski claimed that he had initially only intended to rob Jennifer, but that the situation had escalated. He admitted to sexually assaulting and killing her, then driving her car to the remote location in Forest Park where it was found. The confession provided answers to questions that had puzzled investigators for nearly 3 decades. It explained how Jennifer ended up in Forest Park, confirmed that she had been the victim of a random crime, and provided closure for her family and the investigators who had worked on her case for so many years. With Kowalski's confession and the overwhelming DNA evidence, the prosecution's case was strong. However, the defense attempted to argue that Kowalski's age and declining mental health made him incompetent to stand trial. Competency hearings were held in late 2021, with multiple psychologists and psychiatrists evaluating Kowalski's mental state. While they confirmed that he was suffering from early-stage dementia, they concluded that he was still competent to understand the charges against him and to assist in his defense. The trial began in February 2022, nearly 28 years after Jennifer's murder. Due to Kowalski's age and health issues, the proceedings were expedited. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, Kowalski's confession, and testimony from investigators and the Walsh family. The defense did not dispute the evidence but argued for leniency based on Kowalski's age and the decades that had passed since the crime. They portrayed him as a changed man who was no longer a threat to society. On March 8, 2022, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Robert Allen Kowalski guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Jennifer Walsh. The verdict was met with tears of relief from the Walsh family and applause from the packed courtroom. At his sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, several members of the Walsh family gave victim impact statements. Susan Walsh told the court about the decades of pain and uncertainty her family had endured, and about the daughter and sister they had lost. Jennifer would have been 47 years old now, Susan Walsh said. She would have been a teacher, probably a mother, definitely a light in this world. Robert Kowalski took all of that away from her, and from us. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced Kowalski to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Given his age, it was essentially a death sentence, but it provided the legal closure the Walsh family had sought for nearly 3 decades. The resolution of Jennifer Walsh's case represents a triumph of both technology and human persistence. It demonstrates how advances in forensic science can breathe new life into even the coldest cases, providing answers and justice decades after a crime was committed. Detective Martinez, who had worked on the case for over a decade, called it the most satisfying moment of her career. "This case shows why we never give up," she said. "Technology gave us the tools, but it was the dedication of everyone involved, from the original investigators to the lab technicians to the genealogists, that brought Jennifer's killer to justice." The case also highlights the importance of evidence preservation. The biological evidence collected in 1994 was carefully maintained for nearly 30 years, making it possible for modern technology to finally identify the killer. Without that meticulous evidence preservation, the case might never have been solved. For the Walsh family, Kowalski's conviction provided a sense of closure they had never expected to receive. Michael Walsh died in 2023, just over a year after Kowalski's sentencing, but he lived to see his daughter's killer brought to justice. Susan Walsh continues to advocate for families of murder victims and for the use of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. She has spoken at conferences and training sessions for law enforcement, sharing her family's story and encouraging others never to give up hope. Danny Walsh remains a police officer with the Portland Police Bureau and has become an advocate for genetic genealogy within the department. He has helped secure funding for additional genetic genealogy cases and has worked to train other officers in this emerging field. Robert Kowalski died in prison in January 2024, less than 2 years after his conviction. He was 87 years old. While some might argue that justice came too late, the Walsh family and the investigators who worked on the case believe that the truth finally coming to light was worth the wait. Jennifer's case has become a model for how genetic genealogy can be used to solve cold cases. The Portland Police Bureau has since used similar techniques to solve several other long unsolved murders, bringing closure to additional families and demonstrating the power of this technology. As we conclude our first story tonight, we remember Jennifer Walsh not just as a victim, but as a vibrant young woman whose life was cut tragically short. Her memory lives on through her family's advocacy, through the justice that was finally served, and through the hope that her case provides to other families still waiting for answers. The resolution of Jennifer's case reminds us that justice may be delayed, but it need not be denied. With persistence, technology, and the dedication of those who refuse to give up, even the coldest cases can eventually be solved. I honestly want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tonight, we're traveling to the small town of Oakville, Washington, a quiet community nestled in Grays Harbor County, where the trees whisper secrets and the morning mist clings to old farmhouses. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where children ride their bikes until the streetlights come on, and where missing person cases are supposed to happen to other people, in other places. But sometimes, the most devastating stories unfold in the most unsuspecting places. This is the story of Oakley Carlson, a little girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile, who should be celebrating her 7th birthday this year. Instead, she remains one of Washington State's most heartbreaking mysteries. Our story begins not with tragedy, but with hope. Oakley Carlson entered this world in 2016, a beautiful baby girl born into what should have been a loving family. Her biological parents, Jordan Bowers and Andrew Carlson, lived in the rural areas around Oakville, Washington, a small unincorporated community about 45 minutes southwest of the state capital, Olympia. Oakville is the kind of place where you can still see the Milky Way on clear nights, where the sound of logging trucks on Highway 12 becomes part of the daily rhythm, and where neighbors still wave to each other from their front porches. The population hovers around 600 people, and it's surrounded by dense Pacific Northwest forests that stretch for miles in every direction. For the first few years of Oakley's life, everything seemed normal from the outside. Jordan and Andrew appeared to be just another young couple trying to make it work in small-town America. But behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding, one that would eventually catch the attention of Washington State's Department of Children, Youth, and Families. The first signs of trouble began emerging when Oakley was still a toddler. Neighbors occasionally heard raised voices from the Carlson Bowers household. There were reports of domestic disturbances, though nothing that initially seemed to warrant serious intervention. Like many rural communities, Oakville operated on an unspoken code of minding your own business, a cultural norm that, in this case, may have contributed to a young child falling through the cracks. As Oakley grew from a baby into a walking, talking little girl, those who knew her described her as bright and curious. She had those quintessential childhood qualities that make adults smile, an endless supply of questions, a fascination with bugs and flowers, and that particular brand of fearlessness that only small children possess. By 2019, when Oakley was 3 years old, the situation in her biological home had deteriorated enough that the Washington State Department of Children, Youth, and Families stepped in. This wasn't a decision made lightly. In rural communities like Grays Harbor County, social services are stretched thin, and caseworkers often carry impossibly heavy loads. Oakley was removed from her biological parents' care and placed in the foster home of Jamie Jo and Eric Hiles. This wasn't just any placement. The Hiles family had been fostering children for years, and they had developed a reputation as people who didn't just provide temporary care, but who opened their hearts and homes completely to the children who needed them most. For Oakley, this placement was transformative. The Hiles home was everything her biological home wasn't: stable, nurturing, and filled with the kind of consistent love that allows children to flourish. Jamie Jo Hiles would later describe watching Oakley blossom during her time with their family. The little girl who had arrived quiet and somewhat withdrawn began to laugh more, play more, and display the natural curiosity and joy that every 3-year-old should have. The Hiles family lived in a comfortable home where Oakley had her own room, decorated with the kind of bright colors and stuffed animals that make childhood magical. She attended local preschool programs, made friends, and for the first time in her young life, experienced what it meant to have adults who were completely focused on her well-being and happiness. Eric and Jamie Jo weren't just providing temporary care, they were building a life with Oakley. They took her to the county fair, where she rode the small carnival rides and ate cotton candy with sticky fingers. They celebrated her 4th birthday with a party complete with balloons and a homemade cake. They read her bedtime stories and tucked her in every night, creating the kind of routine and security that forms the foundation of a healthy childhood. During this time, Oakley thrived in ways that spoke to both her resilience and the power of a loving environment. She learned to ride a tricycle in the Hiles driveway, helped Jamie Jo in the garden, and developed a particular fondness for their family dog, a gentle golden retriever who became her constant companion. The Hiles family began to hope that they might be able to adopt Oakley permanently. They had seen how she flourished in their care, and they couldn't imagine their lives without her. But the goal of foster care, whenever possible, is family reunification, returning children to their biological parents once the issues that led to removal have been addressed. In early 2020, after nearly a year in foster care, a decision was made that would haunt everyone involved. Oakley was returned to her biological parents. On paper, Jordan Bowers and Andrew Carlson had completed the required programs. They had attended parenting classes, undergone counseling, and met the bureaucratic benchmarks that the system used to measure readiness for reunification. But those who knew Oakley best, her foster parents, her teachers, and others who had watched her flourish, had deep concerns about this decision. The transformation they had witnessed in Oakley during her time in foster care made them acutely aware of what she had been missing in her biological home. When a child changes so dramatically in a positive environment, it raises uncomfortable questions about what their previous environment must have been like. The Hiles family was devastated. They had hoped to adopt Oakley, and they had grown to love her as their own daughter. But the legal system doesn't always align with what's in a child's best emotional interest, and despite their objections and those of others involved in Oakley's care, the reunification moved forward. Jamie Jo Hiles would later recall the day they had to say goodbye to Oakley. The little girl, now 4 years old, didn't fully understand why she was leaving the only stable home she could remember. The goodbye was heartbreaking for everyone involved, but particularly for Oakley, who clung to Jamie Jo and asked when she would see her again. The early months of reunification seemed to go relatively smoothly, at least from the outside. There were required check-ins with social workers, and initially, these visits didn't raise immediate red flags. Oakley appeared to be adjusting to being back with her biological parents, though those who had known her during her time in foster care noticed that some of the light seemed to have gone out of her eyes. The COVID-19 pandemic hit just as Oakley was settling back into life with Jordan and Andrew. Like everywhere else in the country, Washington state implemented lockdown measures in March 2020. Schools closed, social services had to adapt to remote check-ins, and the normal systems of oversight and community connection that might have provided protection for vulnerable children were severely disrupted. For a child like Oakley, who was already in a precarious situation, the isolation of the pandemic created the perfect storm. With fewer eyes on the family, fewer opportunities for mandated reporters like teachers to observe concerning changes, and social workers conducting virtual rather than in-person visits, red flags that might have been caught early were missed. As 2020 progressed into 2021, the frequency of social worker visits decreased. This wasn't unusual, caseloads were heavy, resources were stretched, and families that appeared to be managing well were given more space. But in Oakley's case, this decreased oversight would prove to be a fatal mistake. February 10, 2021, was a cold Wednesday in Grays Harbor County. The Pacific Northwest winter was in full swing, with the kind of persistent drizzle that makes everything feel gray and subdued. For most people in Oakville, it was just another ordinary day in the middle of a long, difficult winter during an ongoing pandemic. But for 5-year-old Oakley Carlson, February 10, 2021, would be the last day she was ever seen by anyone outside her immediate biological family. The circumstances of this final sighting are both mundane and heartbreaking. Oakley was spotted playing outside the home where she lived with Jordan and Andrew, just being a normal 5-year-old child. Those who saw her that day later described her as appearing thin, perhaps more so than when she had been in foster care, but not in a way that immediately screamed danger. What makes this sighting so significant is what didn't happen afterward. In the weeks and months that followed February 10, 2021, nobody else would report seeing Oakley. Not neighbors, not social workers during their check-ins, not anyone in the community who had known her during her time in foster care. But perhaps most disturbing of all, neither Jordan Bowers nor Andrew Carlson reported their daughter missing. As days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, they continued to live their lives as if Oakley was simply elsewhere. When social workers called to schedule visits, they were told Oakley was sleeping, or sick, or staying with relatives. This is where the story takes on an almost surreal quality. In most missing child cases, parents are frantic. They call police immediately, they organize search parties, they plaster social media with photos and pleas for help. But in Oakley's case, her biological parents seemed remarkably unconcerned about her absence from public view. The spring of 2021 came and went. Oakley should have been finishing kindergarten, playing outside in the warming weather, maybe learning to ride a bike or starting to lose her first tooth. Instead, she had simply vanished from the world, and the two people who should have been most concerned about her disappearance were offering increasingly implausible explanations for why she couldn't be seen or visited. One of the most disturbing aspects of Oakley's case is how long she was missing before anyone in an official capacity realized she was gone. This wasn't a matter of days or even weeks. Oakley had been missing for nearly 10 months before law enforcement was finally notified. The breakdown happened at multiple levels. Social workers, operating under pandemic restrictions and heavy caseloads, accepted explanations from Jordan and Andrew about why Oakley couldn't be seen during their visits. Phone check-ins replaced in-person visits, and when parents said their child was sleeping or sick, caseworkers had little choice but to accept these explanations and schedule follow-up visits. Meanwhile, Oakley wasn't enrolled in school. 5-year-olds in Washington state aren't required to attend school. Compulsory education doesn't begin until age 8, so her absence from any educational setting didn't trigger automatic alerts. This gap in the system meant that one of the most reliable ways of ensuring a child's well-being and safety simply didn't exist for Oakley. The pandemic had also disrupted many of the informal networks that might have noticed a missing child. With fewer community gatherings, less casual interaction between neighbors, and people generally keeping to themselves more than usual, Oakley's absence didn't create the kind of ripple effects it might have in normal times. Throughout the spring and summer of 2021, Jordan and Andrew continued to receive benefits intended for Oakley's care. They collected food assistance, medical coverage, and other forms of support that were predicated on having a 5-year-old child in their home. Yet month after month, nobody actually laid eyes on Oakley herself. The foster family, Jamie Jo and Eric Hiles, had been cut off from contact with Oakley after the reunification. This is standard practice in family reunification cases. Foster families aren't typically allowed to maintain relationships with children who have been returned to their biological families. But this meant that the people who knew Oakley best, who would have immediately noticed changes in her behavior or well-being, were legally prevented from checking on her. As autumn arrived in 2021, Oakley should have been starting kindergarten. She should have been losing teeth, learning to read, making friends, and developing the social skills that come with being around other children her age. Instead, she remained invisible to everyone except Jordan and Andrew, who continued to maintain that she was fine, just not available to be seen by others. December 6, 2021, was the day that Oakley's disappearance finally came to light, but it happened in the most heartbreaking way possible. It wasn't her parents who reported her missing, it was her younger siblings. The story of how authorities finally learned about Oakley's disappearance reads like something out of a nightmare. During an investigation into the welfare of Oakley's siblings, law enforcement officers were speaking with the other children in the home when they asked about Oakley. The response they received was devastating. The children told officers that they hadn't seen their sister in a while. When pressed for details, the children's statements painted a picture that would haunt everyone involved in the case. They described Oakley being kept in what could only be described as imprisonment conditions. According to the children's statements, Oakley had been locked in a closet space under the stairs, a dark, cramped area that was more like a cell than a bedroom. The children described their sister being given little food and being punished severely for minor infractions. They spoke of Oakley crying and begging to be let out of her confinement. Most heartbreakingly, they described how their parents had told them not to talk about Oakley to anyone outside the family. When confronted with these statements from their other children, Jordan and Andrew's explanations became increasingly implausible. They claimed that Oakley was staying with relatives, but they couldn't provide contact information for these relatives. They said she was at a friend's house, but couldn't say which friend or where. As investigators pressed harder, the parents' stories began to fall apart completely. Phone records, financial records, and witness statements all contradicted their claims about Oakley's whereabouts. It became clear that nobody had seen Oakley since February, and that her parents had been actively concealing her absence from authorities. The moment when investigators realized they were dealing with a missing child case, rather than a welfare check, marked a turning point. What had started as a routine investigation into the welfare of Oakley's siblings suddenly became a desperate search for a little girl who had been missing for 10 months without anyone in authority knowing about it. Once the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office realized they were dealing with a missing child case, the investigation moved quickly. The first priority was determining when Oakley had actually last been seen and what might have happened to her. Investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing the last 10 months of Oakley's life. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed surveillance footage from local businesses, and examined financial records to determine if there was any evidence of Oakley being cared for anywhere else. What they found was deeply disturbing. There was no evidence that Oakley had been anywhere other than her parents' home since February. No medical records, no sightings at stores or restaurants, no indication that she had been staying with relatives or friends as her parents claimed. The search for Oakley expanded to include the family's property and surrounding areas. Search and rescue teams combed through the dense forests around Oakville, using trained dogs and sophisticated equipment to look for any trace of the missing girl. The Pacific Northwest wilderness is vast and unforgiving, with thick underbrush, steep ravines, and countless places where evidence could be hidden or lost forever. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details emerged about the conditions Oakley had been living in before her disappearance. Court documents revealed that she had been kept in what could only be described as a makeshift cell under the stairs, a space so small that she couldn't stand up straight, with no windows and minimal ventilation. The psychological evaluation of Oakley's siblings revealed the trauma they had witnessed. These children, barely old enough to articulate their experiences, had watched their sister suffer in ways that no child should ever have to endure. Their statements to investigators painted a picture of systematic abuse and neglect that had been hidden from the outside world. Meanwhile, Jordan Bowers and Andrew Carlson were arrested and charged with various crimes related to child endangerment and abandonment. However, they maintained their innocence and continued to claim that Oakley was safe and staying with relatives. They refused to cooperate with investigators or provide any information that might help locate their daughter. The case began to attract media attention, both locally and nationally. Oakley's story became a symbol of the failures of the child welfare system and the devastating consequences when vulnerable children fall through the cracks. As news of Oakley's disappearance spread throughout Grays Harbor County and beyond, the community response was immediate and overwhelming. In small towns like Oakville, when something happens to one child, it affects everyone. Volunteers organized search parties, combing through the forests and rural areas around Oakville looking for any sign of Oakley. Local businesses donated supplies and resources to support the search efforts. Churches held prayer vigils, and community centers became informal headquarters for coordinating volunteer activities. Jamie Jo and Eric Hiles, Oakley's former foster parents, became the public face of the search for answers. They established a website and social media presence dedicated to keeping Oakley's case in the public eye. Their love for the little girl who had been part of their family for such a brief but important time was evident in everything they did to keep her memory alive. The Hiles family also became advocates for changes in the child welfare system that might prevent future tragedies like Oakley's. They spoke publicly about the warning signs they had seen during the reunification process and the concerns they had raised that were ultimately ignored. Law enforcement continued their investigation, following up on hundreds of tips and leads from the public. Every reported sighting was investigated, every piece of potential evidence was examined, and every possible avenue was explored. But as months passed without any concrete developments, the harsh reality began to set in: Oakley might never be found. The case also sparked broader conversations about the child welfare system in Washington state and beyond. How could a 5-year-old child disappear for 10 months without anyone in authority noticing? What safeguards should have been in place to prevent this kind of tragedy? How many other vulnerable children might be falling through similar cracks? As we approach the 3rd anniversary of Oakley's disappearance, her case remains unsolved. Jordan Bowers has been sentenced to prison time on unrelated charges, but she and Andrew Carlson have never been charged directly in connection with Oakley's disappearance. The lack of physical evidence and their continued refusal to cooperate have made it difficult for prosecutors to build a case. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, Oakley Carlson's story serves as a haunting reminder of the vulnerable children in our communities who depend on systems and adults to protect them. Her case represents not just a single tragedy, but a systemic failure that allowed a bright, curious little girl to disappear from the world without anyone in authority noticing for nearly a year. The small town of Oakville, Washington, continues to carry the weight of Oakley's disappearance. Drive through the community today, and you'll still see her missing person flyers in store windows and on telephone poles. The reward for information leading to her whereabouts remains unclaimed, a testament to the enduring mystery of what happened to her. Somewhere in the misty forests of Grays Harbor County, or perhaps in a place we haven't yet thought to look, the truth about Oakley Carlson waits to be discovered. Her foster parents continue to hope for answers, investigators continue to follow leads, and a community continues to remember a little girl who deserved so much better than the hand life dealt her. As you close your eyes tonight, remember Oakley, not just as a victim, but as a bright, curious child who loved dogs and birthday cake, who learned to ride a tricycle in a foster family's driveway, and who should be in 2nd grade now, losing teeth and learning to read. Her story isn't over. Somewhere, somehow, the truth about what happened to Oakley Carlson is waiting to be found. Until that day comes, we remember her, we search for her, and we work to ensure that no other child falls through the cracks the way she did. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey to the affluent town of New Canaan, Connecticut, a place where colonial homes sit on manicured lawns, where Range Rovers idle in circular driveways, and where the American dream appears to live and breathe in every tree-lined street. It's the kind of community where violent crime feels impossible, where neighbors know each other by name, and where missing person cases are supposed to happen somewhere else, to someone else. But on May 24, 2019, this picturesque New England town became the epicenter of one of Connecticut's most haunting murder cases. This is the story of Jennifer Dullos, a devoted mother of 5, a talented writer, and a woman trapped in a bitter custody battle that would ultimately cost her everything. Unlike many true crime stories that end in questions and speculation, Jennifer's case would eventually find resolution. Not through the discovery of her body, which remains missing to this day, but through the dedication of investigators, the power of forensic evidence, and the courage of those who refused to let her disappear without consequences for those responsible. Let me take you through the final days of Jennifer Dullo's life, the investigation that followed her disappearance, and the long journey to justice that would finally hold her killers accountable. This is a story about love, betrayal, domestic violence, and ultimately, the price of refusing to be silenced. Jennifer Farber Dullo seemed to have it all. Born in 1968 to a prominent New York family, she grew up with every advantage money could provide. She was intelligent, creative, and driven, the kind of woman who could have succeeded at anything she chose to pursue. After graduating from college, she pursued her passion for writing, crafting novels and screenplays with the same attention to detail she would later bring to raising her children. In the late 1990s, Jennifer met Fotis Dullos, a charismatic Greek-American who had come to the United States to build a construction empire. Fotis was everything that attracts people to the American dream made manifest: ambitious, charming, and seemingly successful. He had founded Four Group, a high-end custom home building company that catered to Connecticut's wealthy elite. Their courtship was like something out of a romantic novel. Fotis was worldly and sophisticated, with stories of his family's wealth in Greece and grand plans for building luxury developments. Jennifer, with her literary sensibilities and family connections, seemed like the perfect partner for his ascent into Connecticut's upper social circles. They married in 2004, settling into a stunning colonial home on Jefferson Crossing in Farmington, Connecticut. The house was everything you'd expect from a successful contractor, meticulously designed, filled with high-end finishes, and set on several acres of perfectly landscaped grounds. It was the kind of home that appeared in magazine spreads, the physical manifestation of success and stability. Over the next 13 years, Jennifer and Fotis would have 5 children together, 3 daughters and 2 sons who became the center of Jennifer's world. She threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she had once reserved for her writing. She volunteered at their schools, organized playdates, and created the kind of childhood memories that money can't buy but love and attention can. From the outside, the Dullos family looked perfect. They attended charity galas, went on expensive vacations, and lived the kind of life that others aspired to achieve. Jennifer's social media posts showed a woman who had found her calling in motherhood, sharing photos of birthday parties, school events, and family adventures. But behind the carefully curated facade, cracks were beginning to show. Fotis's construction business, while outwardly successful, was struggling financially. The 2008 recession had hit the luxury construction market hard, and Four Group was carrying massive debt. More troubling still were whispers about Fotis's temperament. Friends and family members began to notice controlling behaviors and fits of anger that Jennifer seemed to work hard to manage and hide. By 2016, Jennifer's marriage to Fotis had become something very different from the fairy tale it had appeared to be. The financial pressures on Four Group were mounting, with the company facing multiple lawsuits from unpaid contractors and unhappy clients. But more concerning to those who knew Jennifer well were the changes they saw in her personality and behavior. Jennifer, who had once been outgoing and confident, began to seem more withdrawn and anxious. Friends noticed that she seemed to constantly monitor Fotis's moods, adjusting her own behavior to avoid setting him off. She stopped talking about her writing, stopped making plans that didn't involve him, and seemed to be walking on eggshells in her own home. The controlling behavior that had been subtle during their courtship became more overt as the years passed. Fotis wanted to know where Jennifer was at all times, who she was talking to, and what she was doing. He had strong opinions about how she should dress, what she should say at social events, and how she should interact with their children. Jennifer's family, particularly her mother Gloria Farber, began to express concerns about the marriage. Gloria had never been completely comfortable with Fotis, finding him charming but somehow inauthentic. As Jennifer became more isolated and seemed to lose her sense of self, Gloria's concerns deepened into genuine alarm. The financial situation was also taking its toll on the family. Despite their outward appearance of wealth, the Dullos family was living on borrowed money and borrowed time. Fotis had been using funds from new construction projects to pay debts from old ones, a dangerous financial shell game that couldn't continue indefinitely. In 2017, Jennifer made a decision that would ultimately save her children's lives but cost her own. She decided to leave Fotis. This wasn't an impulsive decision born of a single argument, but rather the culmination of years of emotional abuse and controlling behavior that had gradually worn down her sense of self-worth and independence. The decision to leave wasn't easy. Jennifer knew that Fotis wouldn't accept the end of their marriage gracefully, and she was terrified of what he might do. She began documenting incidents of his controlling behavior, keeping a journal that would later become crucial evidence in understanding the dynamics of their relationship. Jennifer also began working with a therapist who specialized in domestic abuse situations. Through therapy, she began to understand that what she had been experiencing wasn't normal marital conflict, but rather a pattern of emotional abuse designed to maintain control over her. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. In June 2017, Jennifer made her move. While Fotis was traveling for business, she packed up their 5 children and moved to a rental house in New Canaan, Connecticut. She chose New Canaan specifically because it was close enough for the children to maintain their friendships and activities, but far enough from Farmington to provide some physical and emotional distance from Fotis. The moment Jennifer filed for divorce in June 2017, what had been a private marital struggle became a very public and increasingly bitter legal battle. Fotis was blindsided by Jennifer's decision to leave, and his reaction was swift and vindictive. He immediately hired aggressive legal representation and began a campaign to maintain control over both Jennifer and their children. The custody battle that ensued was unlike anything most family court judges had seen. Fotis demanded full custody of the children, claiming that Jennifer was mentally unstable and unfit to be their primary caregiver. He hired private investigators to follow her, attempted to access her medical records, and filed motion after motion designed to drain her financial resources and emotional energy. Jennifer, meanwhile, was fighting not just for custody of her children, but for their safety. In court documents that would later become public, she detailed incidents of Fotis's controlling and intimidating behavior. She described how he had installed tracking devices on her car, how he monitored her phone calls and emails, and how he had threatened to take the children away from her if she ever tried to leave him. The court appointed a guardian ad litem to represent the children's interests, and initially, the arrangement seemed to be working in Jennifer's favor. The children were thriving in New Canaan, attending excellent schools and maintaining stable routines despite the chaos of their parents' divorce proceedings. But Fotis was relentless in his pursuit of control. He challenged every decision Jennifer made regarding the children, from their medical care to their extracurricular activities. He demanded detailed accounting of how she spent the temporary support payments he was required to make, and he used the children as weapons in his war against Jennifer. Perhaps most troubling were the allegations that began to emerge about Fotis's behavior during his court-ordered visitation time with the children. Jennifer documented instances where the children returned from visits with their father seeming anxious and upset. They spoke of their father asking them inappropriate questions about their mother's activities and relationships. The financial aspects of the divorce were equally contentious. Jennifer's attorneys discovered that Fotis had been hiding assets and manipulating financial records to make his income appear lower than it actually was. For groups, complex financial structure made it difficult to determine exactly what assets were available for division, and Fotis seemed to be using this complexity to his advantage. As the custody battle dragged on through 2017 and into 2018, the toll on Jennifer became increasingly evident to those who knew her. She lost weight, seemed constantly stressed, and spoke frequently about her fears for her children's safety if Fotis were to gain custody. But Jennifer was also showing remarkable strength and determination. She had found her voice again, and she was using it to protect her children. She documented everything, saved every threatening text message, and built a careful record of Fotis's behavior that she hoped would convince the court to limit his access to their children. While Jennifer was fighting for her life and her children's safety in family court, Fotis was building a new relationship that would ultimately become central to the tragedy that followed. In late 2017, he began dating Michelle Traconis, a Venezuelan-American woman who worked in public relations and had a teenage daughter from a previous relationship. Michelle was beautiful, sophisticated, and initially seemed to believe Fotis's version of his divorce proceedings. He portrayed himself as the victim of a vindictive ex-wife who was trying to poison their children against him and steal his hard-earned assets. It was a narrative that Michelle, who had no direct knowledge of Jennifer or the reality of their marriage, initially accepted. Michelle Troconis came from a prominent Venezuelan family and had lived a privileged life before moving to the United States. She was educated, spoke multiple languages, and moved in social circles that overlapped with Connecticut's wealthy elite. On the surface, she seemed like an unlikely candidate to become involved in a murder conspiracy. But as her relationship with Fotis deepened, Michelle became increasingly invested in his version of reality. She began to see Jennifer not as an abuse victim trying to protect her children, but as an obstacle to her own happiness with Fotis. This shift in perspective would prove to be crucial in understanding how she eventually became complicit in Jennifer's murder. Fotis was skilled at manipulation, and he used the same techniques that had initially charmed Jennifer to draw Michelle into his web. He painted himself as a successful businessman being destroyed by a bitter ex-wife, a loving father being kept from his children by false allegations, and a man who deserved better than what life had dealt him. Michelle began accompanying Fotis to court hearings, a presence that Jennifer found deeply unsettling. Here was another woman, someone who had never met Jennifer or her children, inserting herself into the most private and painful aspects of Jennifer's life. The power dynamic was particularly troubling because Michelle's presence seemed to embolden Fotis in his increasingly aggressive legal tactics. As 2018 progressed, the relationship between Fotis and Michelle intensified. She moved into his Farmington home, the same house that Jennifer had fled with their children. Michelle's teenage daughter also became part of this blended household, adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. What Michelle didn't initially understand was that she wasn't just dating a man going through a difficult divorce, she was becoming involved with someone whose control issues and violent tendencies were escalating as he lost his grip on the family he considered his property. Friends of Michelle's would later testify that they noticed changes in her personality as her relationship with Fotis progressed. She became more secretive, more defensive about Fotis's behavior, and more willing to accept explanations that previously would have raised red flags for her. As 2019 began, the custody battle between Jennifer and Fotis had been raging for nearly 2 years with no resolution in sight. But the dynamics were beginning to shift in ways that terrified Jennifer and should have alarmed everyone involved in the case. Fotis's financial situation was becoming increasingly desperate. For Group was on the verge of bankruptcy, with creditors circling and lawsuits mounting. The expensive legal battle with Jennifer was draining what resources he had left, and the temporary support payments he was required to make were a constant source of resentment. More troubling still was Fotis's increasingly erratic behavior. Jennifer documented several incidents where he had violated the terms of their custody agreement, including showing up at the children's school unannounced and attempting to take them without permission. These violations resulted in court sanctions, but they also demonstrated an escalating willingness to ignore legal boundaries. Jennifer's fear was becoming palpable to those around her. She confided in friends that she believed Fotis was capable of violence, and she worried constantly about what might happen if he were granted unsupervised access to their children. She had begun varying her routines, taking different routes to and from the children's activities, and being hypervigilant about her surroundings. In early 2019, Jennifer's attorney filed a motion requesting that Fotis's visitation with the children be supervised due to his increasingly concerning behavior. The motion detailed incidents of emotional abuse, manipulation, and violations of court orders. It was a legal document, but reading between the lines, it was also a cry for help from a woman who sensed that she was running out of time. Fotis's response to this motion was explosive. He accused Jennifer of parental alienation, claimed that she was mentally unstable, and demanded that she undergo psychiatric evaluation. But more concerning were the private communications he was having with Michelle Troconis and others about his plans to solve his Jennifer problem once and for all. Text messages that would later be recovered by investigators showed that Fotis was becoming increasingly obsessed with the idea that Jennifer was the source of all his problems. He spoke about her in dehumanizing terms, referred to her as his enemy, and made statements suggesting that his life would be better if she simply didn't exist. Michelle, rather than being alarmed by these communications, seemed to encourage Fotis's anger toward Jennifer. She participated in conversations about Jennifer that were filled with vitriol and contempt, and she began to see herself as Fotis's partner not just romantically, but in his war against his ex-wife. The spring of 2019 would bring several court hearings that seemed to be moving in Jennifer's favor. The judge was becoming increasingly concerned about Fotis's behavior and was seriously considering limiting his access to the children. For Jennifer, this felt like validation and hope. For Fotis, it felt like the final injustice that required drastic action. Friday, May 24, 2019, began like any other day for Jennifer Dullos. She was staying at her mother's apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, having brought the children there for a long weekend. It was Memorial Day weekend, and they had planned to spend time together as a family, visiting museums and enjoying the city. Jennifer woke early that morning, as she always did. She was meticulous about routines, particularly when it came to her children's schedules. She had planned to drive back to New Canaan that morning to take her youngest child to a doctor's appointment, then return to the city for the rest of the weekend. The drive from Manhattan to New Canaan takes about an hour in normal traffic, and Jennifer made this trip frequently. She knew the route well, often using the time to make phone calls to friends or to simply enjoy a few moments of solitude between the demands of single motherhood and the stress of her ongoing custody battle. Jennifer left her mother's apartment around 8 a.m., telling her mother that she would be back by early afternoon. She was driving her black 2017 Chevrolet Suburban, a large SUV that she had chosen specifically because it was safe and could accommodate all 5 of her children and their various sports equipment and school bags. The last confirmed sighting of Jennifer alive was at approximately 8:05 a.m., when security cameras captured her SUV leaving the garage of her mother's Manhattan apartment building. She was alone in the vehicle, dressed casually in workout clothes, and appeared to be following her normal routine. Jennifer's phone records show that she made several calls during the drive to New Canaan, including one to her divorce attorney to discuss an upcoming court hearing. These conversations were normal and routine. There was nothing in her voice or manner that suggested she had any awareness of the danger that awaited her. She arrived at her New Canaan home at 4 Wells Lane at approximately 10:25 a.m. This timing was confirmed by surveillance cameras from neighboring homes, which showed her SUV turning into her driveway. The house was a beautiful colonial that Jennifer had been renting since leaving Fotis, and it had become a true sanctuary for her and the children. What happened next would be reconstructed months later through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and digital records. But in the moment, Jennifer Dullos simply disappeared from the world as if she had never existed. When Jennifer failed to return to Manhattan as planned, her mother became concerned. Jennifer was punctual to a fault, and she always called if she was going to be late. When hours passed without any word, Gloria Farber began making phone calls, trying to locate her daughter. By late evening, when Jennifer still hadn't returned and wasn't answering her phone, her mother contacted the New Canaan Police Department to report her missing. This call, made at 7:57 p.m. on May 24, 2019, would launch one of the most intensive missing person investigations in Connecticut history. The investigation into Jennifer Dullos's disappearance began immediately, but it would take months of painstaking work to uncover the truth about what happened to her on May 24, 2019. The New Canaan Police Department, working with the Connecticut State Police and the FBI, launched a massive investigation that would eventually span multiple states and involve dozens of investigators. The first major breakthrough came from surveillance cameras throughout New Canaan and the surrounding areas. Investigators spent countless hours reviewing footage from traffic cameras, business security systems, and residential doorbell cameras to track Jennifer's movements on the day she disappeared. What they found was deeply disturbing. Security footage showed Jennifer's SUV leaving her driveway at 4 Wells Lane around 10:25 a.m. on May 24, but Jennifer was no longer driving it. Instead, the cameras captured what appeared to be a man behind the wheel, wearing a dark-colored shirt and baseball cap. Even more incriminating was footage from later that same day showing Fotis Dulos and Michelle Treconis driving around Hartford, Connecticut, making multiple stops at various locations where they appeared to be disposing of evidence. The surveillance footage showed them stopping at over 30 different locations, including dumpsters, storm drains, and wooded areas. At each stop, one or both of them would get out of the vehicle and dispose of bags or other items. This footage would become crucial evidence in the case, as it showed a clear pattern of behavior consistent with attempting to dispose of evidence from a crime scene. The investigation team also discovered that Fotis had borrowed a friend's red Toyota Tacoma pickup truck on the morning of May 24. This truck was captured on surveillance cameras traveling from Farmington to New Canaan around the time of Jennifer's disappearance, and then returning to Farmington later that day. Forensic analysis of Jennifer's home at 4 Wells Lane revealed evidence of a violent struggle. Despite attempts to clean the scene, investigators found blood evidence in the garage that was later confirmed through DNA testing to belong to Jennifer. The blood spatter patterns indicated that she had suffered significant trauma in that location. Additional evidence found at the scene included zip ties, which investigators believed had been used to restrain Jennifer, and cleaning supplies that had been used in an attempt to remove evidence of the crime. The forensic team also found traces of Jennifer's blood on paper towels and other items that had been recovered from the various disposal locations visited by Fotis and Michelle. Phone records revealed that both Fotis and Michelle had turned off their cell phones or put them in airplane mode during the critical hours when Jennifer disappeared. This attempt to avoid creating digital evidence backfired, as the sudden cessation of normal phone activity actually created a suspicious pattern that investigators were able to identify. The investigation also uncovered financial records showing that Fotis had recently taken out a significant life insurance policy on Jennifer, naming himself as the beneficiary. This policy, combined with his desperate financial situation, provided a clear motive for murder. The path to justice for Jennifer Dulos would be long and complicated, marked by tragedy and legal maneuvering that tested the patience of everyone seeking accountability for her murder. In January 2020, just 8 months after Jennifer's disappearance, Fotis Dulos died by suicide in his Farmington home as police were preparing to arrest him on murder charges. Fotis's death meant that he would never face trial for Jennifer's murder, but it didn't end the quest for justice. Michelle Treconis and Kent Mawhinney, Fotis's attorney who had allegedly helped plan the murder, were both charged with conspiracy to commit murder and other related crimes. Michelle Treconis's trial began in early 2024, and it captivated Connecticut and the nation. Prosecutors presented a compelling case showing how she had not only helped Fotis plan Jennifer's murder but had also actively participated in the cover-up afterward. The evidence against Michelle was overwhelming. Surveillance footage showed her helping Fotis dispose of evidence throughout Hartford on the day of the murder. Phone records revealed suspicious communications between her and Fotis in the days leading up to Jennifer's disappearance. Most damning of all were her own statements to police, which contained numerous lies and inconsistencies that prosecutors argued showed her consciousness of guilt. Despite Jennifer's body never being found, she was officially pronounced dead through a declaration of death by a Connecticut judge in October 2023, allowing the murder charges to proceed. The medical examiner testified that Jennifer likely suffered traumatic, blunt force injuries, based on the blood evidence found at her home. On March 1, 2024, Michelle Treconis was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and other charges. On May 31, 2024, she was sentenced to 14.5 years in prison for her role in Jennifer's murder and the subsequent cover-up. The sentencing hearing was emotional, with Jennifer's family and friends finally having the opportunity to speak about the impact of her loss. Her mother, Gloria Farber, spoke about the devastating effect Jennifer's murder had on her 5 children, who lost not only their mother but also had to grapple with the knowledge that their father was responsible for her death. Tonight, as we close Jennifer's story, her 5 children are being raised by their grandmother, surrounded by love and support as they work to heal from the trauma of losing their mother in such a violent way. They attend excellent schools, participate in activities their mother would have been proud of, and are growing up knowing how much Jennifer loved them. Jennifer Dullos was 50 years old when she was murdered, in the prime of her life and devoted to her children. She died because she had the courage to leave an abusive marriage and fight for her children's safety. Her story serves as a reminder that domestic violence can escalate to murder, and that the most dangerous time for an abuse victim is often when they try to leave. But Jennifer's story is also one of justice ultimately served. Through the dedication of investigators, the power of forensic evidence, and the courage of those who refused to let her be forgotten, her killers were held accountable. Her legacy lives on in her children, who carry her strength, her love, and her determination to create better lives for themselves. Please, I'm putting it out there, if you're watching this video and haven't subscribed, please consider supporting my channel. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions are what fuel my content creation. Let's build a community together. And please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 4. In this story, we're traveling to Portland, Oregon, to explore a case that has puzzled investigators for over 2 years now. This is the story of what happened along the Springwater Corridor Trail in the early hours of March 15, 2023. The morning mist was still clinging to the Willamette River when Sarah Martinez began her daily jog along the Springwater Corridor Trail. It was 6:47 a.m. on March 15, 2023, and the 34-year-old nurse practitioner had been following this same routine for 3 years, ever since moving to southeast Portland. The Springwater Corridor stretches for 21 miles through Portland and beyond, following an old railway line that was converted into one of the region's most popular recreational trails. On this particular morning, as Sarah's footsteps echoed softly on the paved path, she noticed something unusual near mile marker 12, just south of the Powell Butte Nature Park entrance. At first, it looked like someone had abandoned camping gear beside the trail. A sleeping bag, partially unzipped, lay beneath a cluster of Douglas fir trees about 15 feet from the main path. But as Sarah slowed her pace and looked more carefully, she realized this wasn't abandoned equipment at all. The sleeping bag wasn't empty. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her voice, usually steady from years of medical training, wavered as she spoke to the dispatcher. "I'm on the Springwater Corridor Trail, near Powell Butte. I think I've found a body." Portland Police Bureau officers arrived within 12 minutes, followed quickly by detectives from the Bureau's homicide unit. What they discovered would launch an investigation that continues to this day, a puzzle with pieces that seem to lead everywhere and nowhere at once. The victim was a 28-year-old man named Thomas Alexander Reed. Tom, as everyone called him, was a freelance graphic designer who had moved to Portland just 8 months earlier from Sacramento, California. He lived alone in a small apartment in the Hawthorne district, about 4 miles from where his body was found. To understand what happened on that March morning, we need to understand who Tom Reed was, and what had brought him to Portland in the first place. Thomas Alexander Reed was born on August 3, 1994, in Fresno, California, to parents Michael and Linda Reed. He was their only child, and by all accounts, they were a close-knit family. Tom showed artistic talent from an early age, spending hours sketching in notebooks and later teaching himself digital design software in high school. After graduating from California State University, Fresno, with a degree in visual communications, Tom worked for several years at a mid-sized marketing firm in Sacramento. His colleagues described him as quiet but friendly, someone who preferred small gatherings to large parties, and who could often be found working late into the evening, perfecting a logo design or tweaking the layout of a brochure. But Tom had always dreamed of working independently, of being his own boss. In the summer of 2022, he made the decision that would change everything. He quit his job, packed his belongings into his 2018 Honda Civic, and drove north to Portland, drawn by the city's reputation as a haven for creative professionals and its lower cost of living compared to California's major cities. Tom found a studio apartment on Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard, in a converted house that had been divided into 4 small units. His landlord, Janet Patterson, a retired teacher in her 70s, lived in the main part of the house. She would later tell investigators that Tom was an ideal tenant, quiet, always paid his rent on time, and often helped her with small tasks around the property. "He was such a sweet young man," Janet recalled during her police interview. "Very polite, very respectful. He'd always stop to chat when he saw me working in the garden. He seemed happy here in Portland, excited about his future." Tom's freelance career was slowly gaining momentum. He had several regular clients, including a local coffee roastery and a small non-profit organization focused on environmental conservation. His work was good, clean, modern designs that captured exactly what his clients were looking for. He wasn't getting rich, but he was paying his bills and doing what he loved. Those who knew Tom described him as someone who valued routine and structure. He worked from his apartment most days, taking breaks to walk around the neighborhood or grab coffee from one of the many cafes along Hawthorne. In the evenings, he often went for long walks, exploring different parts of the city. Tom had joined a hiking group that met on weekends, and while he was still building friendships in his new city, he seemed to be settling in well. His last Instagram post, shared 3 days before his death, showed a sunset view from Mount Tabor with the caption, "Still can't believe I get to call this place home." But there was something Tom hadn't shared with anyone in Portland, something that investigators would only discover after diving deep into his background. Something that might explain why he ended up alone on that trail in the early hours of a March morning. March 14, 2023, the day before Tom's body was discovered, began like any other Tuesday for the young designer. Security camera footage from a nearby convenience store shows him purchasing coffee and a breakfast sandwich at 8:30 a.m. Janet Patterson saw him collecting mail from the front porch around noon, and they exchanged their usual friendly greeting. Tom's phone records show that he spent much of the afternoon working, with several calls to clients and exchanges of emails about ongoing projects. Everything seemed normal, routine, unremarkable. But something changed that evening. At 6:47 p.m., Tom's phone received a text message from an unknown number with a 503 area code, a local Portland number. The message was brief: "We need to talk. Meet me at the usual place. Come alone." This message puzzled investigators from the beginning. Tom had only been in Portland for 8 months. What usual place could the sender be referring to? And who had Tom been meeting regularly enough to establish such a meeting spot? Phone records show that Tom tried calling the number back immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail, a generic automated message with no personalized greeting. He tried twice more over the next hour, with the same result. At 8:15 p.m., neighbors in Tom's building heard his door close and footsteps on the stairs. Security footage from a traffic camera at the intersection of Hawthorne and 39th Avenue captured Tom's Honda Civic heading southeast at 8:22 p.m. This is where the trail begins to grow cold, and where the mystery deepens. Tom's car was found the next morning in the parking area near the Powell Butte Nature Park, about a quarter-mile from where his body was discovered on the trail. The car was locked, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. His wallet was still in the glove compartment, containing $73 in cash and all his credit cards. His laptop bag was on the passenger seat, computer still inside. The location itself raised questions. Powell Butte Nature Park covers 612 acres of meadows, forests, and hiking trails in southeast Portland. It's a beautiful area during the day, popular with hikers, bird watchers, and mountain bikers. But at night, it's isolated, with no lighting along the trails and minimal security patrols. Why would Tom choose to meet someone here, in the dark? And who was he meeting? Investigators canvassed the area, interviewing regular visitors to the park and nearby residents. Several people reported seeing a car matching Tom's description in the parking area around 9 p.m. on March 14, but no one reported seeing Tom himself or anyone else in the area. The trail cameras maintained by Portland Parks and Recreation had been experiencing technical difficulties that week, and unfortunately, none of them captured any footage from the evening Tom disappeared. As investigators pieced together Tom's final hours, they discovered something else troubling. Tom's phone had been turned off, or the battery had died, at 9:34 p.m. on March 14. The last signal from the device came from a cell tower that covered the Powell Butte area. But here's what makes the timeline even more mysterious. The medical examiner determined that Tom had died sometime between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. on March 15, several hours after his phone went silent. What happened during those missing hours? Where was Tom, and who was he with? Detective Maria Santos had been with the Portland Police Bureau's Homicide Unit for 11 years when she was assigned to the Thomas Reed case. A methodical investigator known for her attention to detail, Santos approached the case with the systematic precision that had helped her achieve one of the highest clearance rates in the department. The initial examination of the scene yielded few clues. Tom's body was found lying beside the trail, partially concealed by the sleeping bag that had originally belonged to him. Investigators found the receipt in his apartment, dated just 3 weeks earlier from an outdoor gear store in downtown Portland. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. But despite extensive searching of the area, no weapon was ever found. The medical examiner noted that the injury pattern suggested the attack came from behind, and that Tom likely died quickly. There were no defensive wounds on Tom's hands or arms, suggesting he may not have seen the attack coming. This detail haunted Detective Santos. It suggested either that Tom trusted his attacker, or that he was taken completely by surprise. The investigation expanded rapidly. Santos and her team interviewed Tom's clients, his hiking group, his neighbors, and anyone else who had regular contact with him. They reviewed security footage from businesses along every possible route between Tom's apartment and Powell Butte. They analyzed his financial records, his social media accounts, and his email correspondence. What they found was a portrait of a young man who seemed to have no enemies, no dangerous habits, and no obvious reason to be targeted for violence. But as they dug deeper, some puzzling details began to emerge. First, there was the matter of Tom's freelance work. While his official clients were exactly what you'd expect, small businesses and nonprofits needing design work, investigators discovered that Tom had been earning additional income through a platform called Creative Connect, a website that matched designers with clients for anonymous projects. Through Creative Connect, Tom had completed dozens of small jobs over the past 6 months. The work ranged from simple logo designs to more complex branding packages. Most of the clients paid through the platform using pseudonyms or business names that were difficult to trace. One particular client, going by the username Riverview_LLC, had hired Tom for multiple projects over the past 3 months. The payments were larger than usual, sometimes $500 or $600 for work that typically paid half that amount. The client always requested rush delivery and paid immediately upon completion. But when investigators tried to contact Riverview_LLC through the platform, they discovered the account had been deleted on March 16, just 1 day after Tom's body was found. This discovery led Santos and her team down a new path of investigation. Could Tom's death be connected to his anonymous freelance work? Had he seen something, designed something, or learned something that made him a target? The second puzzling detail emerged from Tom's phone records. While the mysterious text message on March 14 was the most obvious anomaly, a closer examination revealed a pattern of calls that investigators initially missed. Over the past month, Tom had received several calls from different phone numbers, all lasting less than 30 seconds, all ending with Tom hanging up. When investigators tried calling these numbers, they found that most had been disconnected or belonged to disposable cell phones. It was almost as if someone had been trying to reach Tom repeatedly, using different phones each time, and Tom had been avoiding the calls. But avoiding calls from whom? And why? As Detective Santos continued her investigation, she decided to take a closer look at Tom's life before Portland. Sometimes, she knew, the answers to a present-day mystery could be found in the past. Tom's parents, Michael and Linda Reed, drove up from Fresno as soon as they learned of their son's death. The grief-stricken couple stayed in Portland for 2 weeks, helping with the investigation and trying to understand what had happened to their only child. During multiple interviews, they painted the same picture that Tom's Portland acquaintances had: a quiet, artistic young man who kept to himself but was well-liked by those who knew him. They couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt their son. But when Santos asked specifically about Tom's final months in Sacramento, she noticed a subtle change in his parents' demeanor. They became more guarded, more careful with their words. Tom seemed stressed during his last few months in California, Linda Reed admitted during one interview. He was working a lot of overtime, staying late at the office almost every night. We thought it was just because he was trying to save money before moving to Portland. Michael Reed added, he mentioned having some difficulties with a coworker, but he didn't want to talk about it. Tom was never one to complain or cause drama. This was the first Santos had heard about any workplace issues in Sacramento. She immediately contacted the marketing firm where Tom had worked, requesting to speak with his former supervisor and colleagues. What she learned there added a new dimension to the case. According to Tom's former supervisor, Jennifer Walsh, Tom had indeed been having problems with a coworker during his final months at the company. The coworker was Ryan Mitchell, a sales representative who had joined the firm about a year before Tom left. Ryan and Tom clashed from the beginning, Walsh explained during a phone interview. Ryan was very aggressive, very competitive. He had some big accounts, and he expected the design team to drop everything whenever he needed something. Tom was more methodical, and he didn't respond well to pressure tactics. The conflict had escalated over a particular project, a major rebranding effort for one of the firm's biggest clients. Ryan had promised an unrealistic timeline, and when Tom couldn't deliver the designs fast enough, Ryan had accused him of deliberately sabotaging the project. It got pretty heated, Walsh recalled. Ryan accused Tom of trying to make him look bad in front of the client. Tom filed a complaint with HR about Ryan's behavior. It was unpleasant for everyone involved. The HR complaint had been filed just 6 weeks before Tom quit his job and moved to Portland. Detective Santos immediately requested Ryan Mitchell's contact information and employment records. What she discovered made her pulse quicken. Ryan Mitchell had left the Sacramento marketing firm 3 months after Tom's departure. According to his LinkedIn profile, he had moved to Portland in January 2023, just 2 months before Tom's death, to take a sales position with a tech startup in the Pearl District. This couldn't be a coincidence. Santos tried calling the phone number listed in Mitchell's employment file, but it had been disconnected. The tech startup confirmed that Mitchell had worked there briefly but had quit without notice in mid-March, just days after Tom's death. When Santos ran a background check on Ryan Mitchell, she found a history of workplace conflicts, several restraining orders filed by ex-girlfriends, and 2 arrests for assault, though both charges had been dropped when the victims declined to press charges. The profile that emerged was of a man with anger management issues, a pattern of aggressive behavior, and a grudge against Tom Reed that went back nearly a year. But could workplace animosity be enough motivation for murder? And if Ryan Mitchell was in Portland, why hadn't he approached Tom directly? Why the mysterious phone calls and cryptic text messages? Finding Ryan Mitchell became Detective Santos's top priority. She issued a BOLO, be on the lookout, alert to law enforcement agencies throughout Oregon and California. She contacted Mitchell's former employers, his known associates, and anyone who might have information about his current whereabouts. The tech startup where Mitchell had briefly worked provided some useful information. According to his supervisor there, Mitchell had been a problematic employee from the start, missing meetings, being argumentative with clients, and showing signs of what the supervisor described as paranoid behavior. He kept talking about someone who had ruined his career in California, the supervisor told Santos. He seemed obsessed with this person, whoever it was. He'd bring it up in completely unrelated conversations. Mitchell had listed an apartment address in the Alberta Arts District on his employment paperwork, but when Santos visited the location, she learned that he had moved out in early March without notice, leaving no forwarding address. The landlord, an elderly man named Robert Chen, remembered Mitchell well, and not fondly. "That guy was trouble from day one," Chen told Santos. "Loud music at all hours, complaints from other tenants, always behind on rent. He moved out in the middle of the night, left the place a mess. I had to keep his security deposit just to cover the cleaning costs." Chen still had some of Mitchell's belongings that had been left behind, mostly clothes and personal items of little value. But among them, Santos found something interesting: a Portland City map with several locations marked in red ink, including Powell Butte Nature Park. This was the first concrete evidence linking Mitchell to the location where Tom's body was found. Santos also discovered that Mitchell had been driving a dark blue 2015 Ford F-150 pickup truck. She added this information to the Bolo alert and began reviewing traffic camera footage from around Powell Butte, looking for any sign of the vehicle. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A jogger named Patricia Williams contacted the Portland police tip line after seeing news coverage of the case. She had been jogging on the Springwater Corridor Trail on the morning of March 15, about an hour before Sarah Martinez discovered Tom's body. "I saw a man walking quickly away from the trail area," Williams told Santos during an interview. "He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and he seemed agitated or upset. He got into a dark pickup truck parked in a pull-out area near the trail entrance." Williams had only seen the man from a distance, but her description was consistent with Ryan Mitchell's physical appearance. More importantly, she had noticed something unusual about his behavior. "He kept looking back over his shoulder, like he was worried someone was following him," she said. "It struck me as odd because there was hardly anyone else around that early in the morning." Santos showed Williams a photo lineup that included Mitchell's driver's license photo. Without hesitation, Williams identified him as the man she had seen. "That's him," she said confidently. "I'm sure of it." The case seemed to be coming together. Santos had established motive: Mitchell's long-standing grudge against Tom. She had opportunity: Mitchell was in Portland at the time of the murder. And now she had a witness who placed him at the scene shortly after the estimated time of death. But Ryan Mitchell had vanished. His truck was found abandoned in a long-term parking garage at Portland International Airport 3 days after Tom's body was discovered. The vehicle had been wiped clean of fingerprints, and there was no indication of which flight Mitchell might have taken or where he might have gone. Airport security footage showed a man matching Mitchell's description parking the truck and walking toward the terminal, but he was wearing a baseball cap and kept his head down, making positive identification impossible. The trail had gone cold once again. As spring turned to summer in 2023, Detective Santos found herself with a case that seemed both solved and unsolved at the same time. She was confident that Ryan Mitchell had killed Tom Reed, but Mitchell had disappeared, possibly fled the country, and might never be brought to justice. But even with Mitchell as the prime suspect, some aspects of the case continued to puzzle her. The anonymous text message that had lured Tom to Powell Butte came from a prepaid phone that was purchased with cash at a convenience store in Gresham, Oregon. Security footage from the store showed a man buying the phone, but his face was obscured by a hood and sunglasses. The timing of the purchase was significant: the phone was bought just 4 hours before the text message was sent to Tom. This suggested that the murder was premeditated, planned in advance rather than committed in a moment of rage. But if Mitchell had planned to kill Tom, why choose such a public location? Powell Butte Nature Park wasn't completely isolated. There were nearby houses, other trails, and regular early morning joggers like Sarah Martinez. Why not choose somewhere more remote, where the body might never be found? And what about the sleeping bag? Tom had purchased it 3 weeks before his death, according to the receipt found in his apartment. But he had never used it for camping. His hiking group confirmed that all their trips had been day hikes, and Tom had never mentioned any plans for overnight camping. Had he bought the sleeping bag specifically for this meeting? If so, why? What kind of meeting requires outdoor gear? Detective Santos also struggled with the timeline. The medical examiner determined that Tom died between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m., but his phone went silent at 9:34 p.m. What happened during those 4.5 hours? The text message had said, "Meet me at the usual place," but Tom had only been in Portland for 8 months. When and where had he previously met with Mitchell? And why would Tom agree to meet someone he'd had workplace conflicts with, especially in such an isolated location at night? One theory was that Mitchell had convinced Tom he wanted to apologize, to make amends for their past conflicts. Tom, by all accounts a forgiving person who avoided confrontation, might have been willing to give Mitchell a second chance. Another theory was that Mitchell had some kind of leverage over Tom, perhaps threatening to damage his freelance career or spread false rumors about his work. This might explain why Tom felt compelled to attend the meeting despite the unusual location and timing. But without Mitchell in custody, these remain just theories. As 2023 progressed, Santos continued to follow up on leads, but they all led to dead ends. Mitchell's family in California claimed they hadn't heard from him and didn't know where he might be. His ex-girlfriends and former co-workers had no helpful information. His financial accounts remained untouched, and there were no credit card transactions or other electronic traces of his whereabouts. It was as if Ryan Mitchell had simply vanished. The case remained open, but Santos was reassigned to new investigations. Tom Reed's murder joined the unfortunate ranks of unsolved homicides, cases where investigators know what happened and who was responsible, but can't prove it in court. Tom's parents established a scholarship fund in their son's name at California State University, Fresno, to support students pursuing careers in graphic design. They also hired a private investigator to continue searching for Ryan Mitchell, though that search has so far been unsuccessful. The Thomas Reed case represents one of the frustrating realities of modern law enforcement. Sometimes knowing who committed a crime isn't enough. Without physical evidence, without the perpetrator in custody, justice remains elusive. But Detective Santos hasn't given up hope. She still receives occasional tips about Mitchell sightings, and she continues to monitor databases and missing person reports, waiting for the day when Ryan Mitchell surfaces somewhere, somehow. 2 years have passed since Thomas Reed's body was found on the Springwater Corridor Trail. The case file remains open on Detective Santos's desk, a reminder of a puzzle that may never be fully solved. In the months following Tom's death, several developments added new layers to the mystery, though none brought investigators any closer to finding Ryan Mitchell. The first development came from an unexpected source, the Creative Connect platform where Tom had been doing freelance work. The company's security team, responding to a subpoena from Portland police, conducted a deeper analysis of the Riverview_LLC account that had been Tom's mysterious high-paying client. What they discovered was troubling. The account had been created using false information and paid for with prepaid credit cards purchased with cash. The email address associated with the account was registered through an anonymous service that made it impossible to trace back to a real person. Most significantly, the projects that Riverview_LLC had commissioned from Tom weren't typical design work. Instead of logos or branding materials, the client had requested detailed maps, floor plans, and what appeared to be security layouts for various Portland area businesses. Tom, focused on the technical aspects of the design work and grateful for the steady income, apparently hadn't questioned why a client would need such detailed architectural drawings. But to investigators, the pattern suggested something more sinister, possible preparation for break-ins, robberies, or other criminal activities. Could Tom have unknowingly been helping someone plan crimes? And had he started to suspect something was wrong? A review of Tom's final communications with Riverview_LLC showed a subtle change in tone during his last few weeks. Where Tom had previously been enthusiastic and accommodating, his final messages were more formal, more cautious. In his last exchange with the mysterious client, Tom had written, "I need to understand better what these designs will be used for before I can complete this project." Can we schedule a call to discuss the specifications in more detail? The response from Riverview_LLC was brief and ominous, no calls necessary. Finish the work as specified. Time is running out. That message was sent on March 13, just one day before the text that lured Tom to Powell Butte. This discovery led Santos to investigate whether any Portland area businesses had been burglarized using methods that matched Tom's designs. She found several cases over the previous 3 months where break-ins had occurred at locations Tom had mapped, but the connection was circumstantial at best. The second development was even more disturbing. In June 2023, 3 months after Tom's death, the Sacramento marketing firm where both Tom and Ryan Mitchell had worked was burglarized. The thieves had targeted the company's client database, stealing hard drives containing contact information and project details for hundreds of businesses. The break-in showed signs of inside knowledge. The thieves knew exactly where to find the servers and had bypassed several security measures with ease. The firm's IT director told investigators that the theft would have required detailed knowledge of the company's computer systems and security protocols. Ryan Mitchell, as a sales representative, would have had access to much of the stolen information during his employment there. Was Mitchell building some kind of criminal network, using stolen client information and Tom's design skills to plan and execute burglaries and other crimes? Had Tom discovered what was happening and threatened to expose the operation? The theory made sense, but like so much else in this case, it couldn't be proven without Mitchell in custody. As 2024 progressed, reported sightings of Ryan Mitchell came from increasingly distant locations: Phoenix, Denver, Chicago, even one alleged sighting in Montreal. Santos dutifully followed up on each report, but none led to concrete evidence of Mitchell's whereabouts. The case began to take on an almost mythical quality among Portland's true crime community. Online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries featured lengthy discussions about the Thomas Reed murder, with amateur investigators proposing theories ranging from plausible to bizarre. Some suggested that Mitchell had been killed by criminal associates and would never be found alive. Others theorized that he had fled to a non-extradition country and was living under a false identity. A few even proposed that Mitchell himself might have been a victim, killed by the same people who had commissioned Tom's design work. But Detective Santos remained focused on the facts she could verify, the evidence she could document, and the hope that someday, somewhere, Ryan Mitchell would make a mistake that would bring him back into the reach of justice. And so, the Thomas Reed case remains unsolved, a modern mystery in a city known for its quirky character and creative spirit. Tom's apartment on Southeast Hawthorne has been rented to a new tenant, his design business is just a memory, and his parents have returned to their quiet retirement in Fresno, forever changed by the loss of their son. The Springwater Corridor Trail continues to attract joggers, cyclists, and nature lovers. A small memorial plaque near mile marker 12 marks the spot where Tom's body was found, placed there by his hiking group as a reminder of a young man whose life was cut short just as he was beginning to build his future. Detective Maria Santos still works cases for the Portland Police Bureau, still carries Tom's file with her, still hopes that somewhere, Ryan Mitchell will surface and justice will finally be served. But until that day, the mystery remains. What really happened during those missing hours on March 14 and 15, 2023? What was Ryan Mitchell's true motive for killing Tom Reed? And where is he now? These questions echo through the misty mornings along the Willamette River, through the coffee shops of Southeast Portland, through the trails and paths where Tom once walked and dreamed of his new life in the Pacific Northwest. Some mysteries are solved by brilliant detective work, advanced forensic science, or lucky breaks. Others remain open, waiting for time and circumstance to reveal their secrets. The Thomas Reed case falls into that second category, a puzzle with too many missing pieces, a story without an ending, a question that may never be fully answered. But Tom Reed was more than just a victim in an unsolved case. He was a son, a friend, an artist who saw beauty in the world and tried to capture it in his designs. He was a young man who had the courage to start over in a new city, to chase his dreams despite the risks and uncertainties. His story reminds us that behind every true crime case is a real person with hopes, fears, and a future that was stolen away. Tom deserved better than to become another statistic, another cold case file, another mystery for strangers to discuss and debate. Somewhere out there, Ryan Mitchell knows what really happened on that March night. Somewhere, the full truth of this story is waiting to be told. Until then, we remember Thomas Alexander Reed, not as a victim, but as a young man who dared to dream, who moved across 3 states to build a new life, and who deserved the chance to see those dreams come true. If you have any information about the Thomas Reed case or the whereabouts of Ryan Mitchell, please contact the Portland Police Bureau. Sometimes, the smallest detail can be the key that finally unlocks a mystery. But now let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we're heading to the shores of Echo Lake in New Hampshire, where a mystery that baffled investigators for 18 months finally found its resolution in the most unexpected way possible. This is a story about secrets buried beneath the surface of a quiet lakeside community, about how guilt can eat away at a person's soul, and about the power of confession to bring both justice and peace. Unlike some cases that remain forever unsolved, this story has an ending, a resolution that came not through brilliant detective work or forensic breakthroughs, but through the simple, powerful act of one person finally telling the truth. I want to tell you about the case that became known as the Echo Lake Confession, and how sometimes, the most complex mysteries have the simplest solutions. Our story begins on a crisp October morning in 2022, when what should have been a peaceful sunrise over Echo Lake became the beginning of one of New Hampshire's most puzzling investigations. Echo Lake sits nestled in the heart of New Hampshire's White Mountains, a pristine body of water surrounded by dense forests of maple, birch, and pine. The lake is small enough to kayak across in 20 minutes, but deep enough in places that local legends speak of cars and secrets resting on its murky bottom. On the morning of October 15, 2022, the lake was particularly beautiful. The fall foliage was at its peak, painting the surrounding hills in brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. A light mist rose from the water's surface, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter's approach. Margaret Whitmore had been coming to this spot for 43 years, ever since she and her late husband purchased their small cabin on the lake's eastern shore. At 76, she still maintained her morning routine of walking down to the dock with her coffee and watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of pink and gold. But on this particular morning, something was different. As Margaret settled into her usual spot on the weathered wooden dock, she noticed something floating about 30 yards from shore. At first, she thought it might be a piece of driftwood or debris that had washed up during the previous night's storm. But as she watched, the object slowly drifted closer, and Margaret realized with growing horror that it wasn't debris at all. It was a person. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. Her voice, usually steady despite her age, trembled as she spoke to the dispatcher. "There's someone in the water," she said. "At Echo Lake. I think they might be dead." The New Hampshire State Police Marine Patrol arrived within 25 minutes, followed by detectives from the Major Crime Unit. What they pulled from Echo Lake that morning was the body of a 42-year-old woman named Victoria Chen, a successful real estate agent from the nearby town of North Conway. Victoria had been reported missing by her business partner just 16 hours earlier, when she failed to show up for an important client meeting and couldn't be reached by phone. Her car had been found in the parking area of Echo Lake State Park, keys still in the ignition, purse still on the passenger seat. The initial examination revealed no obvious signs of trauma, no indication of foul play. Victoria was fully clothed, wearing the same business attire she'd been seen in the previous day. Her cell phone was in her jacket pocket, damaged by the water but potentially recoverable. To the responding officers, it looked like a tragic accident, perhaps a woman going for an evening walk who had slipped and fallen into the lake. Echo Lake wasn't particularly dangerous, but it was deep in places, and the October water would have been shockingly cold. But Detective James Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Major Crime Unit, felt something wasn't quite right about the scene. He couldn't put his finger on it initially, but something about the way Victoria's body was positioned, the location where she was found, the circumstances of her disappearance, it all felt too neat, too convenient. In my experience, Morrison would later tell reporters, when something looks too simple, it usually is. His instincts would prove correct, though it would take 18 months and an unexpected confession to reveal the true story of what happened to Victoria Chen on that October evening. To understand what happened at Echo Lake, we need to understand who Victoria Chen was, and why someone might have wanted her dead. Victoria Lin Chen was born in Boston on March 22, 1980, to parents who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s. She was the youngest of 3 children, raised in a household that valued education, hard work, and traditional family values. After graduating from Boston University with a degree in business administration, Victoria had worked for several years in corporate finance before discovering her true calling in real estate. She had a natural talent for reading people, for understanding what they wanted in a home, and for negotiating deals that satisfied everyone involved. In 2010, Victoria moved to North Conway, New Hampshire, drawn by the area's natural beauty and the opportunity to establish herself in a smaller, more personal real estate market. She quickly built a reputation as one of the most successful agents in the Mount Washington Valley, specializing in vacation homes and luxury properties. Victoria's clients described her as professional, trustworthy, and incredibly dedicated. She would drive hours to show a property, work weekends to accommodate out-of-state buyers, and maintain relationships with clients long after their transactions were complete. But Victoria's success in business wasn't matched by success in her personal life. She had been married briefly in her 20s, a relationship that ended amicably but left her focused entirely on her career. She dated occasionally but never seemed to find someone who could match her drive and ambition. Those who knew Victoria well described her as intensely private about her personal life. She was friendly and outgoing with clients and colleagues, but she kept her inner circle small and guarded her emotions carefully. Victoria lived alone in a beautifully restored Victorian house in North Conway, a property she had purchased and renovated herself as a showcase of her design sensibilities. The house was her pride and joy, featured in several local magazines as an example of successful historic preservation. She had no children, no close family in the area, and few intimate friends. This isolation, which Victoria had always seen as independence, would become a crucial factor in the investigation of her death. The business partnership that Victoria had formed 3 years earlier with another agent, David Foster, was by all accounts successful and professional. Foster described Victoria as a mentor and friend, someone who had helped him transition from a career in banking to real estate. Victoria was the most ethical person I ever worked with, Foster told investigators. She had opportunities to cut corners, to make deals that might not have been in her clients' best interests, but she never did. Her reputation meant everything to her. But beneath Victoria's professional success and carefully maintained image, there were currents of tension and conflict that few people knew about. As Detective Morrison would discover, Victoria had been dealing with several challenging situations in the months leading up to her death. The first involved a difficult client named Robert Ashford, a wealthy businessman from Boston who had been looking for a vacation property in the area for over a year. Ashford was demanding, frequently changing his requirements, and had a habit of blaming Victoria when properties didn't meet his ever-shifting expectations. The second involved a property dispute with a local contractor named Michael Torres, who claimed that Victoria had cost him a lucrative renovation contract by spreading false information about his work quality. Torres had been increasingly aggressive in his communications with Victoria, and she had begun to feel genuinely threatened by his behavior. The third, and perhaps most significant, involved Victoria's growing suspicions about financial irregularities at one of the area's most prestigious real estate firms, Granite State Properties. Victoria had been investigating what she believed might be money laundering or fraud, and she had been quietly gathering evidence to present to authorities. Any one of these situations might have provided a motive for murder. But which one, if any, had led to Victoria's death in the cold waters of Echo Lake? Detective Morrison began his investigation by retracing Victoria's final day, speaking with everyone who had seen or spoken with her on October 14, 2022. Victoria's day had started normally. She had coffee and breakfast at her usual spot, a small cafe in downtown North Conway, where the owner remembered her ordering her regular, a cappuccino and a blueberry muffin. She seemed relaxed and friendly, nothing out of the ordinary. From there, Victoria had gone to her office, where she spent the morning reviewing contracts and preparing for an afternoon showing. Her business partner, David Foster, had spoken with her around 11:30 a.m. about a potential new listing, and he noted that she seemed excited about the property and the commission it might bring. At 2 p.m., Victoria had shown a lakefront property to a couple from Connecticut who were looking for a vacation home. The showing had gone well, and the clients had expressed serious interest in making an offer. Victoria had dropped them back at their hotel and promised to prepare a contract proposal by the following morning. This was the last confirmed sighting of Victoria Chen alive. Her cell phone records showed that she had made several calls between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m., all business-related. The last call was to a client in Boston, confirming an appointment for the following week. At 6:30 p.m., Victoria's phone had pinged a cell tower near Echo Lake State Park. After that, her phone went silent. Morrison's team canvassed the area around Echo Lake, interviewing residents and visitors who might have seen Victoria that evening. The state park closed at sunset, but the parking area remained accessible, and it was a popular spot for evening walks and photography. A photographer named Sarah Williams had been at the lake around 7 p.m., taking sunset pictures. She vaguely remembered seeing a woman in business attire near the parking area, but couldn't provide a detailed description or say whether the woman had been alone. Two teenagers who had been fishing from the boat launch reported seeing a car matching Victoria's description around the same time, but they hadn't paid much attention to the driver. The lack of witnesses was frustrating but not surprising. Echo Lake was beautiful but isolated, especially on a weeknight in October when the tourist season was winding down. Morrison's team also began investigating the three potential sources of conflict in Victoria's life. Robert Ashford, the difficult client, had an alibi. He was in Boston that evening, attending a business dinner with 6 other people. Security footage from the restaurant confirmed his presence. Michael Torres, the contractor, was more interesting. He had no solid alibi for the evening of October 14th, claiming he had been home alone watching television. More concerning, Torres had a history of domestic violence and had been arrested twice for assault, though both charges had been reduced to disturbing the peace. When Morrison interviewed Torres, he found a man who was clearly angry about his conflicts with Victoria, but who seemed genuinely surprised by her death. "Yeah, I was mad at her," Torres admitted. "She cost me a lot of money with her lies about my work. But I never would have hurt her. I'm not that kind of person." Torres agreed to a polygraph test, which he passed, though Morrison knew that polygraph results weren't always reliable. The investigation into Granite State Properties and Victoria's suspicions about financial irregularities proved more complex. The firm was owned by a man named Charles Brennan, who had been in the real estate business for over 30 years and had an impeccable reputation in the community. When Morrison approached Brennan about Victoria's concerns, the older man seemed genuinely puzzled. "Victoria never said anything to me about irregularities," Brennan insisted. "If she had concerns about our operations, I wish she had come to me directly. We've always run a clean business here." Brennan provided access to the company's financial records, which showed no obvious signs of wrongdoing. But Morrison noted that Victoria had been asking questions about specific transactions involving high-end properties and cash buyers, exactly the type of deals that might be used for money laundering. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to stall. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Victoria had drowned, but couldn't determine whether it was accidental or intentional. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication that she had been forced into the water. Without a clear cause of death or a suspect with both motive and opportunity, the case began to grow cold. Morrison continued to follow up on leads and tips, but none led to a breakthrough. The investigation might have remained unsolved indefinitely, if not for a chance encounter on a snowy February evening, 4 months after Victoria's death. On February 18, 2023, Detective Morrison was finishing up paperwork at the State Police Barracks when he received a call that would change everything about the Victoria Chin case. The caller was Margaret Whitmore, the elderly woman who had discovered Victoria's body floating in Echo Lake. She sounded upset, almost frantic. "Detective Morrison, I need to talk to you," she said. "I think I made a mistake. I think I saw something that night, but I didn't realize it was important until now." Morrison drove to Margaret's lakeside cabin immediately, despite the late hour and the snow that was beginning to fall. He found the elderly woman pacing nervously in her living room, clearly agitated. "I've been having nightmares," Margaret explained. "About that morning when I found her. But it's not the finding that's been bothering me, it's what I saw the night before, and I completely forgot about it until now." Margaret explained that on the evening of October 14th, she had been having trouble sleeping. Around 9 p.m., she had gotten up to make herself some tea and had glanced out her kitchen window, which faced the lake. "I saw headlights in the parking area," she said. "Two cars, parked close together. I didn't think much of it at the time. People sometimes come to the lake at night, especially young couples. But then I saw something that struck me as odd." Margaret had seen two figures near the cars, and they appeared to be having some kind of discussion or argument. She couldn't make out details from her house, which was several hundred yards away, but the body language suggested tension. One person was much taller than the other, Margaret recalled. And at one point, the taller person seemed to be gesturing toward the lake. "I watched for a few minutes, but then I went back to bed. I figured it was just a lover's quarrel or something like that." When Morrison asked why Margaret was only remembering this now, she explained that she had been prescribed new medication for her arthritis, and one of the side effects was memory problems. Her doctor had recently adjusted the dosage, and her memory had been improving. "I kept having this dream about headlights and voices," she said. "And finally, I realized it wasn't a dream, it was a memory." This was the first indication that Victoria might not have been alone at Echo Lake that night. Morrison immediately began reviewing the evidence with this new information in mind. If Victoria had met someone at the lake, who was it? And why hadn't that person come forward after her death was reported in the media? Morrison revisited the cell phone records and discovered something he had missed the first time. Victoria's phone had received a call at 6:45 p.m. on October 14th, just 15 minutes after her last outgoing call. The incoming call had lasted only 30 seconds. The number belonged to a prepaid cell phone that had been purchased with cash at an electronics store in Berlin, New Hampshire, 3 days before Victoria's death. The phone had been used only once, for that single call to Victoria. This discovery suggested premeditation. Someone had purchased an untraceable phone specifically to contact Victoria, and they had called her around the time she was at Echo Lake. Morrison's team began canvassing electronics stores in the area, looking for security footage from the days before Victoria's death. At the third store they visited, they found what they were looking for. The security footage from October 11th showed a man purchasing a prepaid phone with cash. The man was wearing a baseball cap and kept his face turned away from the camera, but his height and build were consistent with Margaret Whitmore's description of the taller figure she had seen at the lake. More importantly, the man was wearing a distinctive jacket, a blue and gray windbreaker with what appeared to be a logo on the left chest. Morrison recognized the jacket immediately. It was the same type of jacket worn by employees of Granite State Properties, the real estate firm that Victoria had been investigating for potential financial irregularities. The investigation was about to take a dramatic turn. With the discovery of the jacket connection, Detective Morrison obtained a warrant to conduct a more thorough investigation of Granite State Properties and its employees. What he found there would finally provide the answers he had been seeking for months. Charles Brennan, the company's owner, had been truthful when he said he wasn't aware of Victoria's concerns about financial irregularities. But he hadn't been entirely forthcoming about his company's recent troubles. Granite State Properties had been struggling financially for the past 2 years. The pandemic had hurt the local real estate market, and several large deals had fallen through, leaving the company with significant debt and cash flow problems. Brennan had been forced to lay off 2 employees and had been working with a business consultant to restructure the company's finances. The consultant, a man named Andrew Walsh, had been helping Brennan explore various options for keeping the business afloat. When Morrison interviewed Brennan again, this time with a warrant and a more pointed line of questioning, the older man finally admitted that Walsh had suggested some creative accounting methods to improve the company's financial picture. He said it was common in the industry, Brennan explained. Things like reporting higher sale prices than actual, or using shell companies to make transactions look more profitable than they were. I was desperate, and I let him talk me into it. The schemes Walsh had implemented were sophisticated but not particularly original. They involved creating fake buyers for properties, inflating sale prices in official records, and using a network of shell companies to move money around in ways that made the firm's financial situation look better than it actually was. Victoria Chen, with her background in finance and her reputation for meticulous attention to detail, had begun to notice discrepancies in some of the high-end property transactions that Granite State Properties was handling. She was asking questions about specific deals, Brennan admitted. Wanting to see documentation that we didn't have, or that would have exposed what we were doing. Andrew was getting nervous about it. Andrew Walsh, it turned out, was the key figure in the entire scheme. He was a 52-year-old business consultant who had been convicted of fraud in Massachusetts 8 years earlier but had served only 18 months in prison. He had been operating in New Hampshire under a slightly different name, hoping to avoid detection. Walsh was exactly the right height and build to match Margaret Whitmore's description of the taller figure at Echo Lake. And when Morrison obtained a search warrant for Walsh's apartment, they found the blue and gray windbreaker jacket that had been captured on the electronics store security footage. But Walsh wasn't at his apartment. According to his landlord, he had moved out suddenly in late October, just days after Victoria's death, claiming he had found a new job in another state. The search of Walsh's apartment revealed a treasure trove of evidence. In addition to the jacket, investigators found documents related to the Granite State Properties fraud scheme, a receipt for the prepaid phone, and most damning of all, a handwritten note that appeared to be a rough draft of a text message. The note read, "Need to talk about the Millfield property. Meet me at Echo Lake at 8 p.m. Come alone." The Millfield property was one of the transactions that Victoria had been questioning, a $2.3 million lakefront estate that had allegedly been sold to a buyer from Florida. But Victoria's research had suggested that the buyer didn't actually exist, and that the sale was fabricated to inflate Granite State Properties' revenue figures. Morrison now had a clear picture of what had happened on October 14, 2022. Walsh had used the prepaid phone to lure Victoria to Echo Lake under the pretense of discussing her concerns about the property transactions. Once there, he had killed her, probably by pushing her into the cold water, and then disappeared. But Andrew Walsh had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. His credit cards hadn't been used, his bank accounts remained untouched, and there were no records of him renting apartments or taking jobs under his real name or any known aliases. The case seemed destined to remain technically unsolved, even though Morrison was confident he knew who the killer was and how the crime had been committed. That's when the investigation took its most unexpected turn yet. On March 15, 2024, exactly 18 months after Victoria Chen's body was found in Echo Lake, Detective Morrison received a phone call that would finally close the case. The caller was a man who identified himself as Andrew Walsh. "I need to turn myself in," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't live with what I did anymore." Morrison, who had been hoping for this moment but had never really expected it, kept his voice calm and professional. "Where are you, Mr. Walsh?" "I'm in Burlington, Vermont," Walsh replied. "I've been here for months, but I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't function. I need to tell you what really happened that night." Morrison immediately contacted the Vermont State Police and arranged for Walsh to be taken into custody. He then drove to Burlington himself, determined to hear Walsh's confession firsthand. What Walsh told Morrison in that Burlington police station was both exactly what the detective had expected and completely different from what he had imagined. Walsh confirmed that he had indeed called Victoria using the prepaid phone, and that he had asked her to meet him at Echo Lake. He had been desperate to stop her investigation into the Granite State Properties fraud, knowing that exposure would mean prison time for him and the destruction of his carefully rebuilt life. "I just wanted to talk to her," Walsh said, tears streaming down his face. "I thought maybe I could convince her to drop her investigation, maybe offer her money to keep quiet. I know it was stupid, but I was desperate." According to Walsh's confession, Victoria had arrived at Echo Lake around 7:30 p.m., parking next to his car in the small parking area. She had been suspicious but had agreed to talk, probably hoping to get more information about the fraudulent transactions. "She was smart," Walsh said. "Smarter than I gave her credit for. She knew I was involved in something illegal, and she wasn't going to be bought off or scared off. She told me she had already copied documents and was planning to turn everything over to the authorities." The conversation had grown heated, with Walsh becoming increasingly desperate as he realized that Victoria was not going to be dissuaded from her investigation. In his panic, he had grabbed her arm, trying to prevent her from leaving. "She pulled away from me and started walking toward her car," Walsh continued. "I followed her, still trying to convince her to reconsider. But she was done talking. She got in her car and started the engine." What happened next was what Walsh described as a moment of pure panic and poor judgment. As Victoria was backing out of her parking space, Walsh had jumped in front of her car, pounding on the hood and shouting at her to stop. "She got out of the car to see what was wrong," Walsh said. "I think she was worried she had hit something. That's when I lost control." According to Walsh's confession, he had grabbed Victoria and tried to force her back to his car, intending to drive her somewhere else where they could continue their conversation. But Victoria had fought back, and in the struggle, both of them had ended up near the edge of the lake. "I pushed her," Walsh said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to push her so hard, but I was angry and scared and not thinking clearly. She fell backwards into the water." Walsh claimed that he had immediately tried to help Victoria, but she had hit her head on a rock when she fell, and she was unconscious. The October water was shockingly cold, and Victoria's heavy business clothes had quickly become waterlogged, pulling her down. "I tried to get her out," Walsh insisted. "I went into the water after her, but it was so cold and dark, and I couldn't find her. I panicked and got out of the water, and by the time I could think clearly, it was too late." Instead of calling 911 or trying to get help, Walsh had fled the scene, leaving Victoria to drown in the cold waters of Echo Lake. The confession answered many of the questions that had puzzled Morrison throughout the investigation, but it also revealed the tragic reality that Victoria's death might have been prevented if Walsh had simply called for help instead of trying to cover up what had happened. Andrew Walsh was extradited to New Hampshire and charged with second-degree murder in the death of Victoria Chen. The legal proceedings that followed would provide the final chapter in this long and complex case. Walsh's defense attorney, a public defender named Patricia Mills, faced a challenging task. Her client had confessed to killing Victoria, but he maintained that it had been an accident, not a premeditated murder. This was a tragic accident that occurred during a heated argument, Mills argued during pre-trial hearings. Mr. Walsh never intended to kill Ms. Chen, and his actions after the incident, while morally wrong, were the result of panic and fear, not criminal intent. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Robert Harrison, argued that Walsh's actions before, during, and after Victoria's death demonstrated clear criminal intent. The defendant used a false identity to purchase an untraceable phone, Harrison argued. He lured the victim to an isolated location under false pretenses, and when she refused to be intimidated, he killed her and fled the scene, leaving her to die alone in the cold water. The case hinged on whether Walsh's actions constituted murder or manslaughter, and whether his confession could be trusted given the length of time that had passed and his obvious motivation to minimize his culpability. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the physical evidence that Morrison's team had collected, including the jacket, the phone records, and the handwritten note found in Walsh's apartment. They also had Margaret Whitmore's testimony about seeing two people arguing near the lake on the night Victoria died. But the defense argued that Walsh's decision to confess voluntarily, after 18 months of successfully avoiding capture, demonstrated genuine remorse and supported his claim that the killing had been accidental. The case never went to trial. In October 2024, almost exactly 2 years after Victoria's death, Walsh agreed to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for a sentence of 15 to 25 years in prison. During the sentencing hearing, Walsh addressed Victoria's family directly, though none of them were present in the courtroom. Victoria's parents had died several years earlier, and her siblings chose not to attend the proceedings. "I know that nothing I can say will bring Victoria back or undo the harm I've caused," Walsh said, reading from a prepared statement. "I will spend the rest of my life regretting what happened that night, and I hope that someday I can find a way to make amends for what I've done." Judge Sarah Campbell, who had presided over the case, sentenced Walsh to 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the first 15 years. Ms. Chen was a respected member of her community who was simply trying to do the right thing by exposing fraud and corruption, Judge Campbell said during sentencing. "Your actions not only ended her life but deprived the community of someone who stood for integrity and honesty in business." The case against Charles Brennan and Granite State Properties was handled separately. Brennan cooperated fully with investigators and agreed to plead guilty to fraud and tax evasion charges. He received a sentence of 5 years in prison and was ordered to pay substantial restitution to clients who had been affected by the fraudulent transactions. Granite State Properties was dissolved, and its assets were liquidated to help pay the restitution and legal fees. The resolution of the Victoria Chen case brought a sense of closure to the community around Echo Lake, but it also raised questions about what might have been done differently to prevent the tragedy. Detective Morrison, reflecting on the case months later, noted that the investigation had been hampered by the initial assumption that Victoria's death was accidental. The lack of obvious signs of struggle and the remote location had made it seem like a tragic accident rather than a murder. "If we had treated it as a homicide from the beginning, we might have found the evidence sooner," Morrison admitted. "But sometimes cases develop in ways you don't expect, and you have to follow the evidence wherever it leads." The case also highlighted the importance of witness testimony, even when witnesses don't initially realize the significance of what they've seen. Margaret Whitmore's delayed recollection of the two cars and the argument she had witnessed proved crucial to solving the case. "Mrs. Whitmore's memory issues actually worked in our favor," Morrison explained. "If she had remembered seeing the argument right away, she might have talked herself out of it or convinced herself it wasn't important. But when the memory came back months later, it was vivid and detailed." The Victoria Chen case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of financial desperation and the lengths people will go to protect their secrets. Andrew Walsh's decision to commit fraud had led him down a path that ultimately resulted in murder, destroying multiple lives in the process. Victoria's former business partner, David Foster, established a scholarship fund in her memory to help young people pursue careers in ethical business practices. The fund provides grants to students studying business, finance, or real estate, with an emphasis on integrity and community service. Victoria believed that business should be about more than just making money, Foster said at the scholarship fund's inaugural ceremony. She believed that success should be measured by how much good you do for your community, not just by your bank account balance. The house where Victoria had lived in North Conway was sold to a young family who appreciated its history and architectural details. The new owners said they were honored to live in a home that had belonged to someone who had stood up for what was right, even when it put her in danger. Echo Lake itself remains a popular destination for tourists and locals alike. The small memorial plaque that was placed near the boat launch in Victoria's memory has become a reminder of the importance of speaking up against wrongdoing, even when it's difficult or dangerous. The lake's waters still reflect the changing seasons, from the brilliant fall foliage to the pristine winter snow to the fresh green of spring. But for those who knew Victoria Chen, the lake will always be a place where truth and justice ultimately prevailed, even if it took longer than anyone had hoped. Detective Morrison, who retired from the state police in 2025, often reflects on the Victoria Chen case as one of the most important investigations of his career. Not because it was the most complex or the most high-profile, but because it demonstrated the power of persistence and the importance of never giving up on the search for truth. Victoria deserved justice, Morrison said in his retirement interview. She was killed because she refused to look the other way when she saw something wrong. The least we could do was make sure her killer was held accountable. And so we come to the end of the story of Victoria Chen and Echo Lake, a case that reminds us that sometimes the most important investigations are the ones that seem impossible to solve. Victoria Chen was more than just a victim, she was a woman who stood up for what was right, even when it put her in danger. Her investigation into financial fraud might have seemed like a simple business matter, but it represented something much more important: the courage to speak truth to power, even when the consequences might be severe. Andrew Walsh's confession, 18 months after the crime, demonstrated something we don't often see in true crime stories: the power of guilt and conscience to ultimately lead to justice. His decision to turn himself in didn't undo the harm he had caused, but it did provide answers and closure for a community that had been searching for the truth. The case also reminds us of the importance of careful investigation and the value of witnesses who may not immediately realize the significance of what they've seen. Margaret Whitmore's delayed recollection of the argument she witnessed at Echo Lake was the key that unlocked the entire mystery. Detective Morrison's persistence in treating the case as a potential homicide, even when the evidence initially suggested an accident, demonstrates the importance of thorough police work and the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads. But perhaps most importantly, the Victoria Chen case reminds us that behind every crime statistic is a real person with hopes, dreams, and the right to live their life in safety. Victoria was building a successful career, helping families find their dream homes, and working to expose corruption in her industry. Her death was not just a loss to her family and friends, but to an entire community that benefited from her integrity and dedication. The shores of Echo Lake continue to welcome visitors who come to enjoy the natural beauty of New Hampshire's White Mountains. The lake's waters reflect the sky and the surrounding forests, creating a scene of peaceful beauty that belies the tragedy that occurred there. But for those who remember Victoria Chen, the lake will always be a place where justice was ultimately served, where truth emerged from the depths, and where one woman's courage to do the right thing was finally vindicated. Sometimes the most powerful stories are not about unsolved mysteries or cases that remain forever in doubt. Sometimes the most powerful stories are about the simple truth that good people who stand up for what's right deserve to be remembered, and that those who harm them deserve to be held accountable. Victoria Chen stood for integrity, honesty, and the courage to speak up against wrongdoing. Her legacy lives on in the scholarship fund that bears her name, in the young people who will be inspired by her example, and in the reminder that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, is always worth the risk. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.